Welcome to Calm Facts for Sleep. Tonight, we're going to drift through quiet, steady facts about pyramids, how they were built, what they were meant to do, and what these ancient shapes can still teach us about human patience, planning, and belief. We'll focus mostly on the pyramids of ancient Egypt, from the earliest experiments to the great monuments that still stand in the desert. You don't need to remember anything. Just get comfortable. Let your breathing slow down, and allow the facts to become a calm background as you rest. If you enjoy sleep-friendly history like this, please subscribe for more long, relaxing videos. When most people imagine a pyramid, they picture a single shape rising from open sand, quiet and alone. But in ancient Egypt, a pyramid was rarely meant to stand by itself. It was usually the centerpiece of a larger, carefully arranged place, an entire complex of buildings and paths designed for ritual, remembrance, and order. The pyramid was the most visible element, but not the whole story. Many royal pyramid sites were connected to the Nile Valley through a planned route. Close to the floodplain, there was often a valley temple, placed where boats and supplies could arrive more easily when the river was high. From there, a long, raised causeway climbed toward higher ground, linking the world of water and farms to the world of stone and desert. For Egyptians, the desert edge could feel like a boundary between cultivated life and the wider, older landscape that seemed permanent and unchanging. Near the pyramid itself, there was typically a mortuary temple where offerings could be prepared and presented. Nearby, there might be courtyards, walls, storage rooms, and smaller related monuments. Around the edges, there were often tombs for officials and traces of work areas and housing. So instead of picturing a pyramid as a single object, it can be more accurate and strangely more calming to picture a functioning site, people moving in predictable routines, food being prepared, tools being repaired, records being kept, and ceremonies repeating across years. The pyramid form did not appear suddenly. Before pyramids, Egyptians built elite tombs, commonly known as mastabas, rectangular flat-top structures with gently sloping sides. A mastaba could look simple from the outside, but it already expressed a key idea: a visible monument above ground and a protected burial space below. The surface held the name and identity of the person. The depth held the body and burial goods. Over time, royal tombs became more ambitious, not only because kings wanted to impress. In Egyptian thought, a king's death was not simply an ending. It was a transition that needed to be managed carefully through architecture and ritual. A stable, enduring tomb supported a stable kingdom, and building something enormous required a kind of power that was also administrative: the ability to organize labor, move materials, and sustain a long project without losing control. At Saqqara, the step pyramid associated with King Djoser marks a major change in scale and method. Instead of a single mastaba-like platform, it rises in stacked layers, as if a tomb were being lifted upward in stages. What's especially interesting is that it seems to have begun as a simpler form and then expanded, meaning the project evolved while it was being built. The complex around it is large, with walls and ceremonial courtyards that create a defined sacred environment, not just a burial marker. In later tradition, the official Imhotep became strongly linked to the project, remembered as a figure of exceptional skill and wisdom. After step pyramids came the desire for smooth sides, the pure triangular plains most people picture today. That transition involved experimentation. At Dashur, the bent pyramid changes its slope partway up, shifting to a gentler angle. It is one of the clearest reminders that pyramid building was not a single perfect blueprint handed down unchanged. It was a learning process. Builders adjusted when they needed to, responding to what the stone and structure were telling them. Nearby, the red pyramid shows a more consistent, smooth-sided design, a sign that experience was accumulating and becoming reliable. By the time the Giza pyramids were built, Egypt had already practiced this kind of work for generations. Even then, each pyramid was a massive logistical undertaking. The Great Pyramid, associated with Khufu, was once wrapped in fine white limestone casing that made it look smooth and bright in the sun. Much of that casing was removed in later centuries and reused elsewhere, which is why the surface looks stepped and rough today. If you imagine it newly finished, it would have looked less like a ruin and more like a single clean shape cut into the skyline. Inside, the Great Pyramid is not an endless labyrinth. It is a small set of carefully planned corridors and chambers. It includes the space traditionally called the King's Chamber, built with granite, and above it are relieving spaces designed to manage the immense weight. There is also the Grand Gallery, tall and narrow, rising with a sense of controlled precision. The interior feels restrained, almost minimal, and that restraint is part of what makes it so striking. A huge exterior sheltering a small number of critical spaces. Many pyramids show careful alignment with the cardinal directions. This kind of orientation required observation and measurement, and it also carried meaning. The north in particular was connected to the circumpolar stars, stars that do not set, and the idea of enduring, stable existence. When people talk about pyramid building, myths often rush in, especially the idea that it could only have been done with mysterious lost technology or only through a single, simple story about forced labor. But what archaeology points to is something more realistic and more human. Organization. Worker settlements near Giza show signs of housing, food production, and medical care. Tools included copper implements, stone pounders, wooden sledges, ropes, and abrasives like sand to help shape stone. The work was difficult, but difficulty is not the same as impossibility, especially when work is divided, trained, repeated, and supported by planning. Stone had to come from somewhere, and that story matters too. Much of the limestone could be quarried locally, while granite for certain internal elements often came from the Aswan region in the south. That implies transport systems, boats, staging areas, timing, and coordination, so that material arrived steadily rather than randomly. A pyramid, in this sense, is as much a monument to logistics as it is to belief. Not all pyramids were built the same way, and not all survived the same way. Later pyramids were often smaller, and some used different core construction methods that weathered more badly over time. In some pyramids, texts were carved inside, the pyramid texts, forming some of the earliest large religious writings known from Egypt. Across centuries, many pyramids were robbed, dismantled, or stripped of casing stone, leaving behind the bones of what once looked sharp and complete. And outside Egypt, pyramids appear in other cultures for different reasons. In Nubia, in what is now Sudan, many steep-sided pyramids were built, often smaller and closely grouped. In Mesoamerica, pyramid forms frequently served as temple platforms tied to ceremonies and public ritual, rather than being built primarily as sealed royal tombs in the Egyptian way. Similar shapes can emerge from practical building logic and powerful symbolism, even when cultures develop separately. If you keep the pace slow and simple, pyramids stop feeling like riddles that must be solved and start feeling like layered evidence. They are made of engineering choices, religious ideas, and everyday human effort. Quiet repetition turning into something vast. Stone placed on stone, season after season, until a shape appears that can outlast the people who made it. If you want, I'll continue in the same calm flow, moving deeper into how pyramid sites were laid out, how blocks were quarried and moved, how casing stones changed the look of the monuments, and what we can tell from the spaces built around the pyramids, not just the pyramids themselves. As you listen, it can help to picture the pyramid site not as a single scene frozen in time, but as a place that changed through the day. In the early morning, the air would have been cooler, and the light would sit low on the stone. Work would begin with routines that were familiar. Tools checked, teams gathered, supervisors assigning tasks, food and water organized before the heat rose. By midday, the desert brightness could flatten everything into pale tones, and shade would become precious. Late in the day, when the sun softened, the stones would take on warmer colors, and the site would feel different again, as if it were quietly breathing with the change in light. To understand pyramids, it helps to understand the landscape they sit within. The Nile Valley was the center of Egyptian life, green, wet, busy and predictable in its seasonal rhythm. The desert edge was different, dry ground, stone plateaus, and long visibility. Pyramid sites are often placed where those worlds meet, close enough to the river for supply and transport, but high enough to be safe from floods, and to stand in clear view. That location is not accidental. It makes the pyramid part of a broader geography of meaning, the living world beside the river, and the enduring world of stone beyond it. When a king chose a pyramid site, it wasn't only about a single building plot, it was about an entire plan. The pyramid, the temples, the causeway, and the surrounding cemeteries needed to fit together in a way that could be maintained, guarded, and used ritually. Even the approach mattered because movement was part of meaning. Walking a causeway from Valley Temple to Mortuary Temple is like walking from one state of the world into another, with each step reinforcing the idea that the king's death was not an end, but a transition managed by ceremony. At Giza, this planning becomes especially clear. The plateau holds three main royal pyramids, aligned in relation to one another and to the surrounding architecture. Each major pyramid is connected to its own temple complex. Nearby are smaller pyramids and subsidiary structures, and stretching out across the plateau are long lines of tombs for officials and family members. This creates a layered landscape of status. The closer you are to the king's pyramid, the closer you are, symbolically and socially, to the center of power. Even in death, proximity mattered. This is one reason pyramids can be studied like cities. They have zones, they have pathways, they have boundaries, they have places for ritual, places for storage, places for administration, and places where people lived. When we say the Great Pyramid, we are often naming the most famous element in a whole network that functioned together. One of the calmest ways to picture the Great Pyramid is to imagine it not as a single giant lift of effort, but as a long-term flow of materials. Blocks had to be quarried, shaped, transported, staged, and placed. That work could be divided into many smaller streams. Some teams might be cutting limestone at the quarry. Others might be smoothing faces or shaping edges. Others might be preparing paths, leveling ground, repairing sledges, or carrying water. In a project that lasts years, continuity matters more than heroism. The pyramid rises because the system keeps working. Quarrying itself was not one simple action. Limestone can vary in quality, even across short distances, and builders would choose stone based on purpose. Some blocks could be rougher inside the core, where they would never be seen. Other stones needed careful faces, especially if they were part of the outer casing or part of a temple wall, where a clean line mattered. Cutting stone with copper tools and abrasives requires patience. It's not fast in a dramatic way. It's fast in a trained way, where skill makes movement efficient and repeatable. Transport is another part of the story that becomes more understandable the more calmly you picture it. Moving heavy stones does not require miracles, but it does require preparation. Surfaces need to be smoothed or wetted, sledges need to be built and maintained, and teams need to pull in coordinated rhythms. The important idea is not one moment of lifting. The important idea is thousands of coordinated steps. When a large block moves even a short distance, and that movement happens again and again, the site slowly changes. The pyramid grows the way a shoreline grows, by countless small additions. Once stone arrives near the building area, it needs staging space, You can imagine piles and lines of blocks laid out in patterns that make sense to the planners, with certain stones set aside for specific locations. You can imagine scribes tracking deliveries and inventories, because large projects depend on knowing what you have and what you need next. If you do not keep track, the entire rhythm breaks, and the pyramid becomes chaos. A pyramid is a lesson in steady control. Then there is the question most people wonder about. How did builders lift blocks upward as the pyramid rose? We do not have one single confirmed method that applies in every case, but we can stay calm about what is realistic. Ramps of some kind, combined with levers and careful staging, are the most practical family of solutions. A ramp doesn't need to be one enormous structure that exists for the entire project in one shape. It can change. It can extend, it can wrap, it can be dismantled and rebuilt as the pyramid reaches new stages. Again, the theme is not mystery, the theme is adaptation. As the pyramid grew, the outer form would have been kept in mind the whole time. The final look depended on casing stones, fitted carefully, creating smooth, triangular faces. These casing stones are one of the most overlooked parts of the pyramid's original appearance. When they were intact, the pyramid was not a mountain of visible blocks. It was a polished geometric plane. The joints were tight. The surface was bright. At a distance, it may have looked almost like a single piece of stone, shaped by design rather than construction. That smoothness is part of the intent. A smooth pyramid is a statement of control over matter. At the top, the pyramid likely had a capstone, sometimes imagined as covered with a reflective material. Though details vary, and evidence differs between pyramids and periods, whether it glittered or simply sat as a final stone, the idea of a summit matters. Pyramids are not only about size, they are about completion. The last stone placed is the proof that the system did not collapse before the goal was reached. Inside, while external work continued, internal corridors and chambers had to be planned in advance. You cannot decide where a chamber goes after you have already placed a mountain above it. That means pyramid building involved long-range design, knowing where the burial chamber would be, how passages would be arranged, and how the structure would manage weight. In the Great Pyramid, the use of granite in the king's chamber and the presence of relieving spaces above it show a deliberate approach to stress. Even if we don't know every detail of the planning process, we can see the results, solutions meant to prevent collapse. It's also worth keeping in mind that pyramids were built to be used, at least in their ritual contexts, long after construction ended. Offerings were meant to continue. Priests and caretakers were meant to maintain cult activity. Endowments, lands and resources dedicated to the pyramid complex, could support ongoing work. In that sense, a pyramid is not only a construction project, it is a long-term institution tied to economy and religion together. Over centuries, those institutions changed. Political power shifted, resources moved, new kings built new monuments, and the old complexes were sometimes neglected. When maintenance fades, stone becomes vulnerable. Casing stones are tempting building material, and once people begin removing them, the pyramid's weathering accelerates. A smooth face becomes stepped. Water finds pathways. Wind and heat do the rest, slowly and without drama. Even so, the basic shape remains, and that persistence is part of what pyramids communicate across time. They are built out of a material that refuses to disappear quickly. They are made of mass, and mass is patient. A pyramid can lose its surface and still keep its identity. As you listen, you can let this idea settle. Pyramids are not only monuments to death, they are monuments to long thinking. They require planners who can imagine a future they will not fully live to see, workers who can repeat a task thousands of times, and a society that can support a project without starving itself. In that way, pyramids are quiet evidence of a civilization's ability to stabilize itself. And now, as we continue, we can move closer to the human side of the story. The people who lived near these sites, what they ate, how their days were structured, what kinds of injuries were treated, and what small traces in the ground tell us about ordinary life in the shadow of extraordinary stone. If you zoom in from the monument to the people around it, the pyramid site becomes quieter in a different way. Not quiet because nothing is happening, but quiet because most of the work is ordinary. It's the kind of ordinary that repeats until it becomes invisible. Mixing and carrying, measuring and checking, shaping stone a little at a time, preparing food, repairing tools, moving water, writing lists, counting deliveries, and doing it again the next day. One of the most useful things archaeology has given us is the reminder that big monuments need small lives. Workers had to sleep somewhere. They had to eat every day. They had to be treated when they were hurt. They had to be organized into groups that could be directed without constant confusion. And because so much of pyramid building is about repetition, it makes sense that the society around the site would develop routines that felt stable, almost like a town's rhythm, even if the town existed mainly to serve a project. Near Giza, evidence points to substantial worker settlements and support areas. When you imagine these places, try not to imagine endless misery as the only possible atmosphere. The work was hard, yes. Stonework is demanding, and the heat can be severe. But the signs of organized housing, large-scale food preparation, and medical treatment suggest a system that at least attempted to keep workers functioning, because a starving, collapsing workforce does not build a pyramid. The project depends on bodies that can return tomorrow. Food is one of the simplest and most revealing facts. A large labor force needs a reliable calorie base. Grain for bread, beer for safe hydration and energy, and additional foods that supply protein and fat. In a world without modern refrigeration, food planning is a kind of engineering. It has to arrive at the right time. It has to be stored. It has to be turned into something eatable quickly and repeatedly. A pyramid, in that sense, is partly made of bread ovens and storage jars. When you picture a day near a pyramid site, you can picture the smell of baking and the smoke of cooking fires rising in thin lines. You can picture large mixing bowls, grinding stones, baskets, and the constant movement of hands. You can picture water carriers and the careful habit of not wasting what is difficult to replace in a dry place. You can picture supervisors who don't only watch stone placement, but who also worry about whether the next delivery of grain has arrived and whether a team has enough to keep working at a steady pace. Tools, too, create a human scale. We often say stone blocks, as if the stone is the main character, but the real character is the toolkit and the skill to use it. Copper chisels and saws can cut and shape stone, but they require maintenance. Copper dulls, edges roll. Tools need sharpening and reshaping. Stone pounders, used to rough out shapes, can break or wear down. Ropes fray, wooden parts split. That means behind every visible step of construction is an invisible stream of repairs. A pyramid site would have had constant, quiet craftsmanship, the kind that keeps a large system from grinding to a halt. Even the ground underfoot matters. To move heavy loads, you need surfaces that behave predictably. Paths need to be cleared and leveled. Loose sand can be a problem. Uneven stones can trip and fracture. If you imagine thousands of feet and sledges moving along the same routes, you can imagine those routes becoming worn into the landscape, compacted, and smoothed by use. In that way, the site slowly shapes itself into efficiency. This is also why the idea of one method for pyramid building can be misleading. Large projects rarely rely on one trick. They rely on many solutions that overlap. Ramps in some places, levers in others, careful staging, shifting work zones, and continuous adjustment as the structure grows. A method that works at the lower levels might not be the best method higher up. As the pyramid rises, the geometry changes, and so do the easiest routes of movement. There is a calm practicality in imagining planners walking the site, looking at progress not as a dramatic story, but as a set of problems to manage. Where is congestion building up? Where are blocks arriving too slowly? Where is the ramp too narrow? Where is the ground softening? Where are workers wasting steps? These are the kinds of questions that turn an impossible dream into a functioning routine. And then quietly, there is the question of skill. Not every task would have been done by the same kind of worker. Some jobs require trained hands, stone dressing, fine fitting, carving, measuring, and setting lines that must be true. Other jobs require strength and rhythm. In a large labor system, the division of labor is not optional. It's the only way to keep quality consistent while also keeping volume high. This helps explain another calm truth. The pyramid is not the work of a single king alone. Even if the pyramid is associated with one ruler, the knowledge behind it is older than that reign, and the labor behind it includes people whose names were never carved into the monument. In a way, pyramids are anonymous architecture on the human level. The monument carries the king's identity, but the work carries a civilization's collective ability. When you step inside the story again, the inner spaces of pyramids can feel strangely minimal. People sometimes imagine hidden libraries, ornate halls, endless corridors, but most pyramids are simple inside because their purpose was not to host crowds. Their purpose was to protect a burial and to support a ritual system that largely happened in the temples outside. The pyramid is the anchor. The daily ritual life, the offerings and ceremonies, belonged to the temple complex. So if you want to picture pyramids as living places, picture the temples and courtyards as the active zones. Picture priests maintaining routines, preparing offerings, reciting formulae, tending to statues and sacred symbols. Picture storerooms filled with goods that could be presented and redistributed. Picture administrative spaces where records were kept, because offerings and supplies are not just spiritual, they are logistical. This is also where pyramids connect to a broader Egyptian habit of thinking in cycles. The Nile floods, retreats, and returns. Fields are planted, harvested, and planted again. In that world, stability comes from repetition. A pyramid complex with its ongoing offerings can be imagined as a kind of ritual cycle that mirrors the natural cycle. The king is kept present through repeated action, not just through stone. Over time, religious texts begin to appear in some pyramids, carved into inner chambers. These are often known as pyramid texts, and they contain spells and statements designed to guide and protect the king in the afterlife. What matters, in a calm sense, is not any single line, but the idea that words themselves were treated as tools. Just as stone tools shape limestone, ritual words shape the passage between life and death. Carving those words into the pyramid turns the interior into a kind of permanent instruction and protection, meant to endure as long as the stone endures. As centuries pass, the pyramid tradition changes. Some later pyramids are smaller. Some use construction methods that do not weather as well. Some are built with cores that are less solid, relying more on rubble and fill, which can collapse and erode when the casing is stripped away. This helps explain why many pyramids across Egypt look so different today. It is not that their builders cared less. It is that resources, priorities, and techniques shifted, and history treated different materials differently. And history, quietly, is one of the main sculptors of pyramids. A pyramid does not remain untouched simply because it is sacred. Stones can be reused, sites can be dismantled, landscapes can be mined for building material by later communities who need it more urgently than they need to preserve a monument. If you imagine a city rebuilding itself after earthquakes or political change, you can imagine stone being taken from old sites because it is already shaped, already valuable. In that sense, the pyramid becomes a quarry after its ritual life fades. It's a strange transformation, but it's a human one. Still, something remains. The basic forms stand because mass resists disappearance. And that persistence creates a quiet psychological effect. When people stand before a pyramid today, they are standing before a time scale that ordinary life does not usually touch. Even a damaged pyramid holds the feeling of distance, as if the stone has been listening to centuries pass like slow wind. And as we continue, we can move into the details people most often wonder about: how builders achieved such straight lines, how they controlled angles, how they measured and checked alignment, and how a structure this large could remain so geometrically consistent. Because one of the most soothing things about pyramids is not only their size, it is their calm geometry, the sense that human hands, working with patience, can coax the world into order. One of the most quietly impressive things about pyramids is that they feel simple when you look at them, even though they are difficult to execute. A pyramid is, in a sense, a promise of order: 4 sides, straight edges, a stable base, a summit. And because the form is so clean, even small errors would have been obvious as the monument grew. That meant the builders needed ways to check themselves constantly, not just at the beginning. The first requirement was a stable foundation. You cannot build a precise shape on ground that shifts unpredictably. So, before a pyramid rose, the site had to be prepared and leveled to a degree that still feels astonishing today. Leveling is not glamorous work. It is careful, slow, repetitive work. Checking, adjusting, checking again. It is the kind of work you feel in your knees and shoulders rather than in your imagination. But that calm discipline is what makes everything else possible. Once a base is leveled, lines must be set. In a world without modern instruments, you still have reliable tools: plumb lines, straight edges, sight lines, shadow measurements, and simple water leveling methods. The principle is the same as it is today. You establish reference points you trust, and you return to them again and again. A pyramid is built by constantly comparing the stone you place to the line you have already declared correct. The cardinal alignment is often what people mention first. Many pyramids are oriented very close to true north, and that kind of accuracy implies careful observation. It doesn't require magic. It requires attention. If you watch the sky night after night and develop routines for measurement, you can find stable directions. And once you have those directions, you can anchor the entire project to them. In Egypt, direction wasn't only practical. It carried meaning, especially the north, connected to the never-setting stars. That means alignment could feel like both engineering and devotion at the same time. Then there is the matter of angle. A pyramid's slope is not just a visual choice, it's a structural decision. Too steep, and you increase risk. Too shallow, and the pyramid spreads wide and demands more material and space. The pyramids of the Old Kingdom show that builders had preferred angles and could reproduce them, which suggests that angle was part of an established tradition, something taught, repeated, and checked. As the pyramid rose, maintaining the intended slope meant constant verification. You can picture workers and supervisors stepping back, looking along faces, sighting lines, checking corners, and correcting small deviations before they become large ones. This is how large, precise things are built. Not with one perfect act at the start, but with thousands of small corrections along the way. Corners are a special kind of challenge. A pyramid's corners carry the geometry. If corners drift, everything else drifts. So corners likely received extra attention because they are where straight lines meet, and where the whole shape declares whether it is true. In a way, the corners are the pyramid's honesty. If the corners are good, the pyramid will look calm and coherent. If the corners are poor, the pyramid will look uneasy, like a shape that can't quite settle. Now, if you imagine the pyramid as it was meant to look in its finished state, you can picture the casing stones. These were the fine outer stones that created smooth faces. Casing stones needed careful cutting because the joints between them were meant to be tight. When casing was intact, The pyramid would not have looked like a rough stack of blocks. It would have looked like a single bright form. And that bright, smooth surface would have changed with the sun, almost glowing at midday, then softening into warm tones at sunset. It's also worth remembering that a pyramid's finished face is not only aesthetic. A smoother outer surface sheds water more predictably and resists certain kinds of erosion better than a jagged surface. Of course, the desert is dry, but rare rains do occur, and when water flows over stone, it follows physics, not mythology. A clean face helps control where water goes, and that can matter across centuries. Inside the pyramid, the geometry becomes more hidden, but the same calm logic applies. Passages have to be cut on intended lines. Chambers need to be placed where weight can be managed. When you see granite beams and relieving spaces, you're seeing a very old version of structural thinking, how to keep a roof from failing when it must carry a mountain. The Great Pyramid, in particular, invites a quiet kind of reflection because its interior is so restrained compared to its exterior, a huge shape, and then inside, a small set of carefully defined spaces. It's almost like the monument is teaching a lesson. That power is not always expressed by filling every space. Sometimes, power is expressed by leaving most of the interior solid, stable, and silent. This brings us back to purpose. The pyramid was not designed as a public hall. It was not designed to be wandered through. It was designed as an anchor, something that would stand in the landscape and declare continuity. The more solid the mass, the more enduring the declaration. And yet, even with all this planning, pyramids were vulnerable to one persistent human reality. People return. They come back in later centuries and reinterpret the monument. They strip casing stones. They search for entrances. They create new openings. They reuse surrounding temples. They build near the old, sacred places. The pyramid becomes part of a living history, whether it wants to or not. When you stand in that thought for a moment, pyramids start to feel less like single-time objects and more like long-lived participants in human life. First, they are built. Then, they are used ritually. Then, they are altered and scavenged. Then, they become symbols again. This time for outsiders, travelers, archaeologists, and modern nations. The pyramid's meaning changes, but the stone remains, quietly taking on new layers of interpretation. As we continue, we can move into another calm question people often ask. What was the pyramid actually protecting? And why were the burial spaces sometimes so minimal? Because the most important thing the pyramid held was not the grandeur we imagine today. It was a carefully protected transition, one that Egyptians tried to secure with architecture, ritual, and the deep belief that a name, properly maintained, could last as long as stone. If you strip away everything modern that we project onto pyramids, the core purpose becomes both simple and strangely intimate. A pyramid was meant to protect a burial, yes, but it was also meant to protect something less visible: identity. In ancient Egypt, a person was not only a body, a person was also a name, a social place, a set of relationships, and a kind of spiritual presence that could continue if it was maintained correctly. For a king, that continuation wasn't private. It was tied to the stability of the world. This is one reason the burial space inside many pyramids can feel smaller than people expect. The goal was not to create a comfortable home for the dead in the way we might imagine today. The goal was to create a secure point of transition and a secure point of focus. A chamber can be small and still be sacred. A chamber can be minimal and still be powerful, because the meaning is not in furniture or decoration alone. The meaning is in the idea that the king's passage has been structured, guarded, and anchored in the landscape. The pyramid, in that sense, is like a lock built around a single key. The mass is the security. The narrow passages are the control. The hidden entrances and blocked corridors are not there for beauty, but for delay. They are meant to slow intruders, to confuse them, to protect the central space, long enough that the king's transition is secure. Even if later robbers eventually succeeded, the intention remains visible in the design. And because robbery was a real risk, pyramid builders did not rely on one kind of defense. They used layers of defense. Some were physical, concealed entrances, portcullis stones, blocking stones, changes in corridor direction. Some were psychological, the sense of a sacred boundary. Some were administrative, guards, maintenance, ongoing presence of priests and staff. And some were spiritual, texts, symbols, and ritual protections meant to make the tomb not only hard to enter, but wrong to enter. It can feel comforting in a quiet way to imagine the pyramid complex as a place that was meant to remain cared for. Offerings were not imagined as a one-time ceremony. They were meant to continue. A mortuary cult could be supported by endowments, land and resources dedicated to feeding the system. If those resources remain stable, the temple can remain active. If the temple remains active, the pyramid remains part of a living religious world, rather than becoming a dead object in the desert. But time changes systems. Dynasties end, administrations shift, priorities move elsewhere. When support fades, monuments begin to drift into vulnerability. And when a monument becomes vulnerable, people notice. They return, not because they are uniquely evil, but because stone and treasure are valuable, and because the past can be mined by the present. One of the calm, steady truths of archaeology is that most ancient tombs were robbed very early. The act is not always dramatic. It can be quiet, local, and practical. A breach can begin as a small opening. A corridor can be explored by lamplight. A sealed stone can be chipped, slowly over time. Once knowledge spreads that a site has been opened, others follow. And the deeper the tomb, the more important that initial delay would have been. The design buys time. It does not guarantee safety forever. This is part of why modern stories about pyramids can become tangled. People look at the empty chambers and ask, where is everything? And the simplest answer most often is that the valuable burial goods were removed long ago. The pyramid as a shell remains. The intended contents often do not. Still, even when robbed, pyramids retain one of their main functions, being a fixed place on the land that anchors memory. Even a violated tomb can continue to exist as a landmark, a statement, a symbol of royal authority that once reached across a whole region. And symbols are powerful. The pyramid shape itself seems to have carried meaning beyond any single king. There are Egyptian ideas that connect pyramids to the primeval mound, the first land that rose from the waters at creation. There is also the simple visual connection. A pyramid resembles a ray of sunlight made solid, or a mountain made geometric, or a stairway turned into a single slope. In a culture where order mattered deeply, a pyramid can feel like order made visible. When you think about that, you can begin to understand why later Egyptians continued to care about pyramids long after the Old Kingdom. Even as burial practices changed, the pyramid remained a kind of reference point. It said, this is what the ancestors could do. This is what a king can leave behind. It became part of a national memory within Egypt itself, not only within modern tourism. And then there is the simple physical fact that pyramids change with distance. From far away, they look smooth and calm, even if their surfaces are rough. From near, they become chaotic with detail. Individual blocks, joints, chips, repairs, and the irregularities created by time. That difference between distant calm and close complexity is part of their emotional power. They teach you that large order can be made out of small variation. The stones also hold quiet clues about construction choices. In some places, you can see that blocks were not identical. They were shaped enough to fit the purpose. Perfection was not the goal everywhere. The goal was structural success and visual coherence, where it mattered most, especially in the casing, the temple walls, and the key ritual spaces. This is how most human systems work. Effort is concentrated where it has the highest impact. If you stand in that thought, the pyramid becomes less like a single masterpiece carved by one perfect mind, and more like a carefully managed compromise between ideals and realities. Ideals, straight lines, smooth faces, perfect orientation, eternal stability. Realities, stone varies, tools wear, people tire, weather changes, politics shifts, time runs out. The miracle, if you want to call it that, is that the balance was achieved well enough that the result still reads as calm geometry thousands of years later. There is also a quiet misunderstanding that can be softened here. People sometimes imagine pyramids as monuments built only to show off wealth, as if they were the ancient equivalent of vanity projects. But within their own context, pyramids were tied to a worldview in which the king's proper burial and continued presence helped maintain cosmic order. The monument was not only a personal statement, it was a public piece of the world's stability. Even if that idea feels distant today, it mattered deeply then. That worldview helps explain why texts and ritual language were treated as practical tools. Words could be carved into stone because words were thought to have power when preserved and spoken. A name could keep a person present. An offering formula could keep food and drink flowing in an ideal sense, even when actual offerings became irregular. A spell could shape the king's path into the afterlife. Whether we interpret these ideas spiritually or symbolically, the calm point remains. The pyramid was designed to work within a system of thought, where architecture, ritual, and language all supported one another. And because pyramids were built within that system, their surrounding spaces mattered just as much as their interiors. The mortuary temple was where offerings happened. The causeway was where processions moved. The valley temple connected the monument to the river, to boats, and to the practical world of supply. If the pyramid is the silent anchor, the temples are the breathing lungs of the complex. This is why, when people ask what's inside the pyramid, the most accurate answer is, sometimes, a small protected core, surrounded by an entire landscape that used to be alive with ritual. If you want to know what the pyramid meant, you look not only at chambers, but at courtyards, altars, storage spaces, and the pattern of nearby tombs. And those nearby tombs are another quiet key. High officials were buried close to royal pyramids, often in mastabas or rock-cut tombs. Their proximity reflects their status and their relationship to the king. It also reflects something practical. Being buried near the center of ritual life could mean being remembered and maintained. In a society that valued ongoing offerings and remembrance, location could be a kind of insurance. So the pyramid site becomes a map of society. The king at the center, the elite around, the workers nearby, the living settlement supporting the whole system. And beyond that, the Nile Valley feeding it. This is how a monument becomes more than stone. It becomes the visible tip of a social structure. If you let your mind rest on these connections, pyramids start to feel less like isolated mysteries and more like calm evidence of a whole civilization working in layers. Stone on stone, ritual on ritual, administration on administration, day after day until the shape appears. And next, we can drift into the things that make pyramids feel personal, even after thousands of years. The small traces of human bodies, injuries, healing, work-worn bones, footprints in mud brick, tool marks on stone, and what those traces suggest about the people who lived close to the monument long enough for it to rise. If you want to feel the pyramid story more clearly, it helps to follow the evidence that sits a little away from the monuments themselves, the evidence of lives lived in the shadow of stone. When archaeologists find worker areas, they're not only finding support, they're finding the real conditions that make a massive project possible, where people slept, where they cooked, how they organized supplies, and how their bodies carried the cost of repeating heavy work day after day. A human body leaves traces in predictable places, In bones, you can sometimes see signs of strain, joints worn in patterns that suggest years of lifting, pulling, carrying, and kneeling. You can also see signs of healing, which matters because healing means care. A broken bone that healed tells you that the person survived the injury long enough for it to knit, which usually requires food, rest, and some form of community support. On a large construction site, that kind of support isn't optional. If you lose too many skilled workers, you lose speed and quality. Caring for workers, in a practical sense, is part of caring for the project. And then there are the smaller traces. Tool marks on stone, abrasion patterns where blocks were rubbed and adjusted, chips and flakes left behind where trimming happened. The quiet mess of work, because real work is never clean. Even when a finished surface looks smooth, the process that created it produces fragments, dust, and the constant need to clear space. One of the calmest realities about pyramids is that they weren't built in a single continuous sprint. They rose through seasons. Egypt's year revolved around the Nile, and that seasonal rhythm shaped labor availability, transport, and scheduling. The river wasn't only scenery, it was infrastructure. It carried stone, grain, wood, and people. When the river was high, movement could be easier in certain ways. When it was low, other tasks might dominate. Pyramid building sits inside that wider rhythm, like a long project breathing with the seasons. You can imagine the work divided into phases, quarrying and cutting that could happen steadily, transport that depended on conditions, setting and fitting that required skilled attention, temple construction that could proceed alongside the pyramid, finishing work, polishing, carving, and adjusting. That would intensify near the end. And through all of it, the administrative work that never stops, counting, recording, assigning, and managing. This is where pyramids begin to feel less like stone mountains and more like organized time. The structure is the final shape of thousands of hours, not just hours of pulling blocks, but hours of planning routes, preparing surfaces, negotiating resources, and maintaining the basic health of a workforce. The pyramid is the visible result of invisible coordination. The Giza Plateau is especially rich in this kind of story because it isn't only one pyramid. It is a landscape of interlocking structures. The three main pyramids, Khufu, Khafre, and Menkaure, are each surrounded by their own networks, causeways, temples, subsidiary pyramids, tombs for officials, boat pits, walls and boundaries that defined sacred and functional space. When you stand back and imagine the plateau during its active period, it begins to resemble an engineered district built to direct movement and meaning. Boat pits are one of those details that quietly change how you imagine the site. Boats were not only practical vehicles, they also carried symbolic weight in Egypt, linked to solar journeys and ritual travel. A boat placed beside a pyramid is not a random offering. It is part of a story about passage, about the king moving with the gods, or moving through the afterlife, in a form that Egyptian imagination understood deeply. The boat on a cosmic river. Then there is the way pyramids were meant to shine. The casing stones, when intact, transformed the monument into a bright geometric presence. Modern viewers often meet pyramids as rough surfaces. Ancient viewers would have met many pyramids as smooth and luminous, especially when new. That brightness is not a small detail. It changes how the pyramid sits in the mind. A bright pyramid doesn't feel like a pile of blocks. It feels like an intentional plane, almost like a piece of the sky translated into stone. When casing is lost, we see the core. The core tells its own story. The practical work of stacking and stabilizing, the choices about block size and placement, the ways builders manage the interior mass. If casing is the pyramid's public face, the exposed core is the pyramid's private structure. Both are real. We simply meet a different layer today than most ancient Egyptians did. The temples, too, are essential for understanding function. The mortuary temple near the pyramid, was where offerings and ritual actions were performed. Offerings sound to a modern ear like simple gifts, but in the logic of the time, offerings were part of a system that maintained the king's status and presence. Food, drink, incense, spoken formulae. These were actions that kept the relationship between living and dead correctly aligned. If you think of the pyramid as the anchor, the temple is the daily practice that keeps the anchor meaningful. The valley temple near the floodplain was a hinge between worlds. It linked the monument to the river, to transport, to the living economy. And the causeway linked the valley temple to the mortuary temple, creating a route that was both practical and ceremonial. In a sense, the causeway is a ritual corridor in the landscape. It's a line drawn between water and stone. This focus on roots and transitions tells you something calm and consistent about Egyptian monumentality. Meaning was often built into movement. The path mattered. The approach mattered. The order of spaces mattered. You didn't simply arrive at the pyramid. You moved toward it through a sequence that shaped how you felt and what you understood. And then with time, those routes changed. Stones were taken. Temples fell. Causeways were buried or broken. The plateau shifted from a managed sacred district into an ancient landscape visited by outsiders, then by travelers, then by modern archaeologists and tourists. The pyramid stayed as the most visible part, but much of the supporting world thinned away, like a shoreline receding. This is one reason pyramids can create strange modern misunderstandings. We encounter the surviving center, but we often miss the surrounding system that made the center make sense. Without the temples, the pyramid feels like the whole story, and so people fill the missing context with whatever stories are loudest. But when you restore the context, even in imagination, the pyramid becomes quieter again. It returns to being a part of a designed environment rather than an isolated riddle. There is also a particular calm that comes from acknowledging uncertainty honestly. We know many things with confidence: where quarries were, what tools were used, how stone behaves, what settlements looked like, what the broader ritual system was. But for some specific details, exact ramp configurations at specific stages, or the precise sequence of certain internal design decisions, we have strong hypotheses rather than absolute answers. That's normal for ancient history, and it doesn't weaken the story. It makes it more human. People solve problems in multiple ways. Different projects can use different solutions, and time erases the temporary structures first. Even so, the overall picture remains steady. Pyramids were built through organized labor, practical engineering, and long-term planning, inside a worldview where architecture was not separate from religion, and religion was not separate from the state. And now, if you let your mind rest on one of the most calming features of pyramids, their geometry, you can feel why they have such a strong effect on modern eyes. A pyramid is stable. It doesn't lean. It doesn't twist. It sits with gravity rather than fighting it. The wide base and narrowing form turn weight into stillness. In a world that feels noisy and unstable, the pyramid feels like an object that cannot be hurried. That feeling is not accidental. It is the emotional reward of careful design. Straight edges, symmetry, repetition. The pyramid isn't only big, it is composed. It stands as if it has chosen to stand, and in the next stretch, we can drift deeper into the most famous place of all, the Great Pyramid itself. Not as a myth, but as a quiet set of choices. Why its interior is arranged the way it is, why certain spaces were built with granite, how the passages guide movement, and what the pyramid reveals when you treat it like engineering, written in stone rather than a secret waiting to be guessed. If you slow the picture down and let it become more sensory, pyramids start to feel less like ideas and more like places. Limestone has its own quiet personality. In bright sun, it can look pale and chalky from a distance, but up close, it can show fine grain, small fossils, tiny variations that remind you it was once seabed turned to stone. Granite feels different, harder, darker, speckled, cooler to the touch in shade, and heavy with density. When you imagine ancient builders choosing where to use granite, you can almost feel the respect in the decision because granite demands effort. Then there is the ground itself. The edge of the Nile Valley is soft with life. Dark soil, plants, water channels, and movement. The plateau is dry and firm, with dust that clings and wind that polishes. A pyramid site sits between those worlds, and that between quality matters. It is part of why the monuments feel like thresholds. They stand where green becomes sand, where daily life meets long time. If you imagine walking up a causeway, the feeling changes with every step. Behind you, the river world. Ahead of you, stone. The causeway lifts you slightly, separates you from the ground, narrows your route, and focuses your attention. Even if you were carrying something practical, grain, tools, jars, the path still shapes your mood. It's hard to walk a long, straight, raised route toward a huge monument without feeling that you are entering a different kind of space. The mortuary temple near the pyramid would have been the place where the pyramid complex felt most alive after construction ended. Offerings are sometimes described as if they were only symbolic, but they also involved real food, real smoke from incense, real sound from recited words, and real movement through courtyards and chambers. The temple would have had storerooms, altars, and places where objects could be cleaned and arranged. There is a quiet order to ritual. Repeated actions done carefully because repetition is the point. Even if you don't share the ancient belief system, you can still understand the comfort of that repetition. A stable routine creates a sense of control, and control creates calm. In that sense, pyramid rituals weren't only about the dead, they were also about the living, about keeping society aligned with its own expectations of order. And then beyond the temples, there were the workers' worlds, less sacred in design, but equally real. Housing areas, cooking spaces, storage for tools, places for repair. When you picture people sleeping near the site, imagine simple rooms, the dust of the day settling, the relief of shade, the feeling of muscles finally resting. Imagine the quiet conversations of workers at night, not about mysteries, but about tomorrow's tasks, about food, about aches, about the river, about home. It's easy to forget that pyramid building was not only heavy, it was also precise. Precision work requires calm attention. It requires steady hands and a mind that can stay focused. In stone dressing, for example, you remove small amounts repeatedly, checking lines, checking flatness, checking fit. The person doing that work is not in a state of chaos. They are in a state of concentration. In a way, the pyramid is partly made of human patience. You can also imagine how sound behaved on the site. In open desert, sound travels differently than in a city. A call from one team to another might carry farther. The scrape of stone on stone might feel sharper. The rhythm of pulling ropes might create a shared tempo. The pounding of stone tools might echo off surfaces. And then, as evening comes, those sounds fall away, and the site returns to wind and silence. If you picture the pyramids when they were new, the whole area would have looked different. With intact casing stones, the pyramids would have reflected light, and the edges would have been sharper. The temples would have been complete, surfaces smoother, walls standing, courtyards clean. Paint and reliefs in temples could add color that we no longer see. Statues could be placed where now there is open ground. The plateau would have been less like a field of ruins and more like an active monumental district. This matters because the feeling of a place influences what people believe about it. A complete complex feels intentional. A ruined complex feels mysterious because ruin creates gaps, and gaps invite invention. If you want to keep the story calm and factual, it helps to imagine completeness, the pyramid, as a functioning part of a designed environment. Over time, when casing stones were removed and temples collapsed, the pyramids began to show their inner bones. The surfaces became stepped, irregular, and open to weather. With each missing stone, the monument's relationship to time changes. It stops being a finished statement and becomes an exposed structure. But even in that exposure, it remains coherent. The pyramid still reads as a pyramid. The geometry persists even when perfection fades. This persistence is part of why pyramids became symbols far beyond Egypt. Travelers and writers encountered them as ancient and already old. They became shorthand for endurance, mystery, and lost worlds. But there is a calm way to handle that symbolism. By remembering that the endurance comes from practical choices. Stone chosen for durability. Mass arranged for stability. Foundations leveled. Geometry repeated. Human effort organized. If you hold on to that calm explanation, the pyramid becomes more impressive, not less, because it means the monument is not impressive due to secrets. It is impressive due to competence, and competence leaves subtle traces in how a monument is laid out. For example, the surrounding tombs, aligned and ordered, show planning beyond one structure. The orientation of temples and causeways shows that builders were thinking in straight lines across wide space. The positioning of structures on the plateau shows that they were thinking about view, approach, and relationship to the wider landscape. There is also a quiet reality that not all pyramids were equally well funded or equally well maintained. Some kings reigned longer and could complete larger projects. Some reigned briefly and left unfinished work. Some later pyramids had different resources available. That means the pyramid tradition includes both triumphs and compromises, but the tradition remains recognizable because the underlying idea stayed powerful. A mountain made by humans, a stable form that touches the sky. Now, as we continue, we can move into the most common questions people ask in a calmer, clearer way. Questions like, how did builders keep corners so straight? How did they keep the base so level? How did they plan internal chambers without modern drawings? And what kinds of measurements and checks would have been part of daily routine? Because behind every giant form is a small practice, repeated until it becomes reliable. If you want a calm, realistic way to understand pyramid precision, imagine the site as a place full of small checks. Not one grand measurement at the beginning, but a habit of measuring that never really stops. Precision at scale comes from returning to the same references again and again, the way a careful person keeps glancing back at a straight edge while cutting wood. The pyramid is a straight edge made enormous, and the builders had to keep proving to themselves that it was still straight. Start with the base. A level base is not simply a good idea, it is the foundation of every other line. If the base is uneven, the pyramid cannot rise cleanly without visible distortion. So leveling was a major task in its own right. It may have involved cutting down high spots and filling low spots, checking repeatedly, and establishing a reference plane that could be trusted. In a dry landscape, water can still be used as a leveling guide because water seeks level naturally. A simple water channel or basin can become a measuring instrument. The technique is not modern. The principle is timeless. Then there is the question of square. A pyramid base needs corners that relate correctly to one another. It isn't enough to have one straight side. All sides must align into a consistent shape. This is where ropes, sight lines, and repeated checks come in. A rope pulled taut is a straight line. A plumb line gives you vertical truth. A measured diagonal can confirm whether a shape is truly squared. These are quiet tools, but they are powerful when used with discipline. Once you have a base that is level and squared, you need to establish direction. Many Egyptian pyramids are oriented very closely to the cardinal points. Achieving that requires observation and routine. You watch the sky, you track consistent points, you compare shadows or stellar positions, and you use those observations to set a line you trust. After that, you treat that line like law. Everything else refers back to it. And that's the calm secret of precision. You decide what you trust, and then you keep returning to it. As the pyramid rises, the next challenge is maintaining the slope. A pyramid's faces are meant to climb at a consistent angle, and if that angle wobbles, the shape will look wrong, even from far away. To prevent that, builders would need some way of checking the face line as it grew, measuring the run and rise, checking the edge line at corners, and ensuring the casing or the intended casing plane stayed true. It helps to remember that a pyramid is not built as one continuous surface from the beginning. It is built in stages, with courses of stone added. Each new course is a chance to correct small drift. If a line begins to wander, you can trim, adjust, or set the next course in a way that brings it back. That is how large forms remain coherent. Constant small corrections, made early, before errors become permanent. Corners would have been watched especially closely. A corner is where two faces meet, and that meeting line carries the whole pyramid's visual authority. Even if the core blocks vary in size and perfection, the corner line can still be kept crisp. This is one reason casing stones matter so much. The casing creates the final visual truth. It can hide minor irregularities in the core, and it can give the pyramid its calm, unified face. And once you picture casing stones clearly, you can see why removing them changes everything. Without casing, you see the construction body. With casing, you see the intended form. In the ancient world, many pyramids would have presented themselves as smooth plains with edges that read like drawn lines against the sky. That is the version that ancient viewers likely held in their minds, pyramids as perfected geometry, not as exposed blockwork. Inside the pyramid, measurement becomes even more unforgiving. A corridor must lead where it is supposed to lead. A chamber must sit where it will not fail. When you build internal spaces, you are committing to the future mass above them. So planning had to happen early, and execution had to be careful. It's useful to imagine that builders were not working blindly. They had experience from earlier pyramids, and they were learning how stone behaves under load. This is why features like corbelled roofs and relieving spaces are so important. Corbelling allows builders to span a space without creating a single flat stone roof that might crack under weight. Relieving spaces above chambers help spread load away from one vulnerable point. These are practical responses to gravity, and gravity is the one force that never changes its mind. If you want to make this feel even more real, imagine the day-to-day routines of checking. Someone with authority walks along a line, sighting it, judging it. Another person measures distances with a rope. Someone else checks vertical truth with a plumb line. If a course is off, it is corrected immediately, because it is cheaper to correct now than later. In this way, precision becomes a culture, something taught, repeated, enforced, and respected. This brings us to another quiet truth. Pyramids are not only about strength, they are about discipline. A society capable of pyramid building is a society capable of sustained order. Not perfect order, not effortless order, but enough order to keep long projects from unraveling. And then there is the question of internal blocking. Those heavy stones designed to seal passages. Even here, you can feel the practical mind at work. If you want to protect a burial, you don't rely on a single door. You create obstacles that require time and effort to remove. You create narrowing spaces that limit movement. You design passages that don't invite easy work. In some cases, you guide intruders into dead ends or confusing routes. The pyramid is both monument and defense. Still, defense is never absolute. Robbery happened, openings were made, monuments were entered, and when that happened, the pyramid shifted from a protected system to a damaged system. But it's worth noting that even robbed pyramids still functioned as symbols, and sometimes even as ritual sites for a while. The stone keeps speaking even when the contents are gone. As centuries passed, the old pyramids became ancient even to later Egyptians. They became part of a deep national past. People could look at them and feel what we still feel now, the sense that human life is brief, and stone is patient. That feeling can lead to reverence, curiosity, or opportunism, depending on the era. but the feeling itself is consistent. And now we can drift into a different part of the pyramid world, one that changes the mood slightly because it takes us from geometry to belief. Not belief in a dramatic sense, but belief as a daily background. The Egyptian idea that names matter, that offerings matter, that order must be maintained, and that architecture can support the invisible parts of life. Because once you understand that background, pyramids stop being strange. They start being logical within their own world. In the Egyptian world, belief was not something separate from daily routine. It was woven into how people understood time, authority, and even basic stability. The land depended on the Nile returning. The harvest depended on timing and order. Society depended on officials doing their jobs, on storehouses being managed, on agreements being kept. In that environment, order was not an abstract idea. It was survival. And pyramids grew out of that same instinct, to secure what matters, to make it last, to keep things in the correct arrangement. For a king, this instinct became immense. A king was not only a political figure, the king was treated as a central part of how the world stayed balanced, how the right rituals happened, how the gods were honored, how the land remained stable. When a king died, that balance needed to continue. The pyramid complex was one way of making that continuation concrete. It gave the king a permanent address in the landscape, and it gave the living a place where the relationship between ruler, gods, and community could be maintained through repeating actions. This is where the importance of names becomes calm and clear. In Egypt, a name was not just a label, it was part of a person's ongoing existence. A name spoken, carved, remembered, and included in ritual could keep a person present. A name forgotten could mean a kind of fading. So monuments were not only about hiding a body, they were about keeping identity anchored. Stone lasts, and so a name carved in stone could be treated as a form of endurance. Offerings fit into the same logic. Food and drink offered in a temple were physical things, but they were also part of a system that linked the living and the dead. The act of offering mattered. The words said during offering mattered. The maintenance of the temple mattered. This is why pyramid complexes were designed with spaces for storage, preparation, and ceremony. The complex was meant to keep functioning because function was the point. The pyramid was not only a finished building, it was intended to be the center of an ongoing routine. This also helps explain why so much of pyramid architecture directs movement. Long causeways, specific approaches, courtyards arranged in sequences. These are not accidents. They create a controlled experience, and controlled experience produces a controlled state of mind. When you move through a designed sequence, you are less likely to treat the place casually. You enter slowly. You adjust your behavior. You align yourself with the space. In a culture that valued order deeply, architecture could train the body to behave in an orderly way. The desert itself contributes to that training. The plateau is open, bright, and exposed. There is less shelter, less softness, fewer distractions. A large stone monument in that environment becomes dominant not only visually, but emotionally. It makes the human feel small, and that smallness can be used to produce reverence. The same shape seen from the valley might feel distant. From the plateau, it feels immediate. The monument is not only above you, it is around you, changing what the sky feels like. And the longer you sit with this idea, the more pyramids feel like expressions of a particular kind of mind. A mind that believes stability can be built, and that the correct arrangement of things, stones, words, rituals, relationships, can hold back chaos. Even the pure geometry of a pyramid reflects that desire. A pyramid is a form that refuses to wobble. It doesn't need arches or delicate balance. It grows quieter as it grows heavier. That quiet heaviness is also why pyramids became such strong symbols later on. Long after the original beliefs shifted, the shape still communicated something humans recognize instinctively: permanence. You can be from a completely different era and still feel that message. The pyramid doesn't need translation. It simply stands, and makes time feel different. But standing doesn't mean unchanging. Over centuries, pyramids became part of new stories. Some were treated as ancient wonders. Some were treated as convenient stone sources. Some were treated as sacred relics of the past. Sand moved around them. Settlements expanded and retreated. Travelers arrived with their own assumptions. And gradually, the pyramids became layered objects. Ancient Egyptian monuments carrying Greek, Roman, medieval, and modern interpretations, like dust settling in thin, quiet coats. When you look at a pyramid today, you are not only looking at Old Kingdom Egypt, you're also looking at everything that happened after it. The missing casing stones are part of that later history. The widened entrances are part of that later history. The broken temples are part of that later history. In a calm way, the pyramid teaches that nothing human stays in one state forever. Even stone monuments, they endure, but they also transform. There is another gentle detail that brings the story back to earth. Pyramids were built by a society that could feed itself well enough to spare labor. Massive construction requires surplus. It requires stored grain, organized distribution, and the ability to move resources away from immediate survival needs. That means pyramids are also evidence of agriculture working, administration working, and supply chains functioning. The pyramid is a monument, but behind it is a system of fields, canals, boat traffic, workshops, and records. Without that support, the monument cannot rise. And because that support depends on stability, pyramids also tell you something about the moment they were built. They are most common in periods when central power was strong and coordinated. In that sense, a pyramid is not only a tomb, it is a signature of a state that can act over a long time. When later periods emphasize different kinds of monuments, it is often because the state is organized differently, or resources and priorities have shifted. As we continue, we can settle into one of the most calming ways to think about pyramids, as the meeting point of three quiet forces: belief, which gives the monument purpose; administration, which gives the monument continuity; and physics, which gives the monument its final shape. Belief explains why anyone would try. Administration explains how they could keep trying for years. Physics explains what worked, what didn't, and why the form still stands. And from here, the story can drift naturally into the different pyramid landscapes beyond Giza. Saqqara's long history of tombs and monuments, Dashur's visible experiments, and the way later pyramids reflect changing materials and changing choices, while keeping the same calm pace, like walking through a wide museum where each room is quieter than the last. We can leave Giza for a moment and let the story widen, because pyramids are not one place and not one moment. They are a long tradition with different phases, different priorities, and different outcomes. When you move away from the famous silhouettes, you begin to see something calmer and more revealing. The process, the experiments, the changes, the way a civilization learns through stone. Saqqara is one of the best places to feel that long timeline. It is not only a single monument, it is a vast cemetery landscape used for centuries. Here, tombs and temples accumulate like layers. The Step Pyramid complex stands as a landmark, but around it the ground is crowded with other structures, mastabas, shafts, and later additions. This matters because it reminds you that pyramid building wasn't a single isolated obsession. It was part of a wider culture of burial and remembrance. Pyramids belong to a world that was already building monuments before pyramids existed, and continued building monuments after the Great Pyramid Age changed. When you picture the Step Pyramid of Djoser, try to picture the feeling of it in its own era. It would have been startling, not because people had never seen stone before, but because of the scale, the coordinated plan, and the way the whole complex creates a sacred zone. The surrounding wall, the courtyards, the ceremonial spaces, these are not accidental. They define an environment meant to reshape behavior. The monument says, "You're not in ordinary space now. You're in a controlled space," and controlled space is one of the underlying themes of pyramids. The pyramid itself is controlled geometry. The complex is controlled movement. Even the desert setting is a kind of control because it strips away distractions and makes the monument dominate the view. From Saqqara, when you travel through the pyramid story, Dashur becomes the place where you can almost see thinking in motion. The bent pyramid is famous because it carries its adjustment on its own face. But behind that visible bend is an invisible story of decision-making. At some point during construction, someone realized that continuing at the original steep slope increased risk. Perhaps cracks appeared. Perhaps stress patterns became worrying. Perhaps earlier experience suggested danger. The response was to change the angle, not to abandon the project, not to pretend nothing was wrong, but to modify the plan. That modification is one of the most human facts about pyramids. It shows builders who could admit that a design needed change and who had enough control over labor and resources to implement that change on a massive structure. In modern life, projects change too. Plans get revised, timelines shift, budgets are adjusted. The bent pyramid is an ancient reminder that big work always involves decisions under uncertainty. Nearby, the red pyramid feels calmer because it is more consistent. It rises with a single slope and suggests a moment when builders had refined their approach to smooth-sided design. In a quiet way, it is like seeing a person after practice. The first attempts are rough and full of correction. Later attempts settle into confidence. Now, one of the gentle misconceptions people carry is that the pyramid story is a straight climb to perfection, reaching its peak at Giza and then abruptly ending. The reality is more interesting. Pyramid building continues after the Giza era, but priorities and methods shift. Some later pyramids are smaller, and not because Egyptians suddenly stopped caring. Smaller can reflect different resource distribution, different political realities, and different architectural strategies. Sometimes the pyramid remains a symbol, but other aspects of the funerary complex take on greater emphasis. One of the biggest changes over time is internal decoration and text. In some later Old Kingdom pyramids, inscriptions known as the pyramid texts appear on the walls of inner chambers. They are not stories in the modern narrative sense. They are collections of religious statements, protections, and guidance. Language treated as a tool. Their presence signals something important. The interior space becomes more explicitly scripted. The walls themselves become part of the ritual technology of the tomb. This also shifts how we imagine the pyramid's interior. In the Great Pyramid, the interior feels restrained and almost silent in terms of text. In later pyramids with inscriptions, the interior becomes a space where language is physically present. That doesn't mean the earlier pyramids lacked religious meaning. It means the expression changed. Sometimes meaning is carried by form and ritual outside. Sometimes meaning is carried by words carved into the stone. And as the tradition continues, you can see another quiet pattern. The relationship between core and casing changes. In some later pyramids, builders used cores that were less solid than the cores of the greatest Old Kingdom examples. They might rely more on fill and smaller stones, with an outer casing meant to give the appearance of a clean pyramid. This can work when the casing remains intact and maintenance continues. But when the casing is stripped away, the weaker core can erode dramatically. That is why many later pyramids look like broken hills today. The ruin is not only time's fault, it is also the result of construction choices, interacting with later scavenging. This brings up a calm but important point. Ancient builders made rational choices within their own constraints. If the goal is to create a pyramid shape efficiently with available resources, building a strong casing over a less perfect core can be a sensible strategy. It creates the intended visual statement while managing cost and time. The pyramid still communicates what it needs to communicate. The problem is not the method. The problem is what happens centuries later, when maintenance ends and casing is removed. So the pyramid tradition contains many different solutions. It is not one blueprint copied endlessly. It is an evolving set of practices shaped by political power, resource access, religious emphasis, and accumulated experience. Now, if you drift beyond Egypt's borders, you find that pyramids appear in other regions in ways that reflect their own histories. In Nubia, in what is now Sudan, there are large fields of pyramids, built by kingdoms that developed their own monumental traditions. Nubian pyramids often look different from Egyptian ones. They can be steeper, narrower, and more closely clustered. Their scale is often smaller than Giza, but their number can be striking. When you imagine a field of many steep pyramids close together, the feeling is different. Less about one overwhelming giant and more about a landscape of repeated forms. The existence of Nubian pyramids also reminds you that monumental traditions travel and transform. Cultural influence can move along trade routes and political relationships, and local societies can take an idea and reshape it into something distinctly their own. A pyramid shape can be adopted without being copied exactly. And then there are pyramids in Mesoamerica, structures that modern people also call pyramids, but which served different purposes in many cases. Many were temple platforms associated with ceremonies, processions, and public ritual. Some contain burials, but the overall tradition differs from Egyptian royal tomb pyramids. The shared geometry can be partly practical. Stacking stone into a stable. Ascending form is a reliable method. The shared symbolism can also be human. Many cultures imagine sacred mountains, places where earth and sky connect. The important calm point is that similar shapes do not automatically require a single origin story. Humans can arrive at similar solutions because the world and the human mind offer similar constraints and similar desires. If you let that settle, the pyramid becomes less like a singular mystery and more like a recurring human pattern. When people want to build something that lasts, something that feels like permanence, a wide base and narrowing ascent is a natural choice. It is stable, efficient, and visually powerful. It turns gravity into stillness. But Egypt's pyramids remain unique in their particular combination of scale, precision, and historical continuity. They sit at a place where central administration was strong enough, long enough, to repeat and refine the tradition across generations. That repeating and refining is one of the reasons the monuments feel so calm. They are not a one-off accident. They are the result of practiced civilization. Now, if you imagine someone living in Egypt during a later period, looking at the pyramids of the Old Kingdom, you can imagine a similar feeling to what we feel now, astonishment mixed with distance. The monuments would already have been ancient. The names of the builders might already have been wrapped in legend. The original rituals might already have faded or changed. The pyramids would be present, but their world would be partly gone. In that sense, pyramids have been historical objects for a very long time. Even in antiquity, people looked at them and felt time stretching. And that long stretch of time is part of their emotional effect. Pyramids are not only about death, they are about patience. They are about work done for a future that the workers will not live to see. They are about a culture deciding that some things should be built to outlast individual lives. From here, we can move into another gentle layer. The myths and misconceptions that grew around pyramids, and the calm facts that soften those misconceptions without turning the topic into an argument. Because pyramids have always attracted stories. The shape is so strong, and the time gap is so large, that the human mind tries to fill the silence with drama. But if you want a sleep-friendly approach, you don't need drama. The real story is steady enough. So we can drift into the most common misconceptions about slavery, about impossible cutting, about secret knowledge, and replace each with a calmer picture. Organization, skill, tools, logistics, and the simple truth that repeated work can build extraordinary things. Pyramids have always collected stories around them, partly because they are so visually simple and so historically distant. When people stand in front of something that old and that large, the mind often reaches for explanations that feel equally large. It's a very human response. A monument that seems beyond ordinary life invites extraordinary narratives. But one of the calmest and most respectful ways to approach pyramids is to let the explanations stay human-sized. Not small, not dismissive, just realistic. The real story is not that pyramids are impossible. The real story is that they are possible in a way that requires patience, coordination, and a culture willing to repeat hard tasks for years without losing structure. One of the most common misconceptions is the idea that pyramids were built only by enslaved people forced into endless suffering. The truth is more layered. Ancient societies did use forced labor in various contexts, and Egypt was not a modern ethical world. But the popular image of millions of enslaved people whipped into building pyramids as the main explanation does not fit well with what we can infer from settlements, organization, and the nature of skilled work involved. Large projects require skilled teams and stable logistics. Skilled work cannot be sustained on the edge of starvation without constant collapse. A functioning long-term site suggests planning, rations, housing, rotations, healthcare of some kind, and administration. The calm point is this: pyramids were built by people living inside a state system. Some workers likely had obligations to serve, some were full-time specialists, some may have been seasonal labor connected to the agricultural calendar, and many were organized into teams with identities and pride. This does not make the work easy, it makes it organized. And organization is what turns hard labor into finished architecture. Another misconception is that the stone cutting is too precise to be done with ancient tools. This often comes from imagining that ancient tools must be crude and ineffective. But simple tools does not mean useless tools. A copper chisel can shape limestone, especially with repeated sharpening and with abrasives. Stone pounders can rough out shapes. Sand can grind and smooth. A saw with abrasive slurry can cut stone slowly but reliably. The method is not about one dramatic cut. It is about controlled removal over time. When people say they couldn't have done that, they are often imagining a modern construction timeline. Fast, loud, compressed. Ancient work can be slower. And when work is slower, you gain a different kind of control. You gain time to check fit, time to correct errors, time to refine technique. Over years, slow precision becomes normal precision. There is also a misconception that blocks must have been lifted straight upward in impossible ways. This comes from visualizing the pyramid like a vertical cliff, but a pyramid is not a cliff. Its shape creates a series of manageable heights and surfaces, and construction can be staged. Ramps, levers, and incremental lifts can function within that staged environment. The exact configuration of ramps may differ between sites and between phases of construction, but the broader principle is stable. You don't need to lift every block in a single heroic motion. You need to move blocks in a controlled system that prevents accidents and keeps flow steady. In that sense, pyramid building is less like a feat of raw strength and more like a feat of traffic management. If you can keep materials arriving, keep paths clear, keep teams coordinated, and keep quality checks consistent, the structure rises almost inevitably. The how is not one secret. The how is 1,000 routines that don't break. Another misconception is that there must have been a lost advanced technology, machines, anti-gravity, or unknown engineering, because the monument feels too refined. But what we see in pyramid history is the opposite of a sudden impossible leap. We see a long line of development, mastabas before pyramids, step pyramids before smooth pyramids, bent adjustments before stable slopes. Different sizes, different cores, different choices. That is exactly what you would expect from human innovation, a series of attempts and refinements. When a culture is building large structures repeatedly, knowledge accumulates. One generation learns what cracks mean. Another learns how to improve hauling paths. Another learns what angles behave best under certain conditions. Another learns how to place beams to protect chambers. That accumulation is powerful. It can produce results that look miraculous to outsiders who see only the end product and not the centuries of practice behind it. Then there is the misconception about perfect uniform blocks, as if the pyramid must be made of identical stones cut like modern bricks. In reality, many core blocks do not need to be perfect. They need to be stable and well placed. The perfect-looking parts would have been concentrated where perfection mattered most: the casing stones, the corner lines, the temple facings, the visible ritual architecture. Inside the mass, stone can be rougher, adjusted with packing, and placed according to practical constraints. This is a very common pattern in human building. Effort is not distributed equally. Effort is aimed where it produces the strongest visible and structural effect. The pyramid's calm visual presence would have depended heavily on the casing and on the disciplined maintenance of overall geometry. The inner body could be more pragmatic without ruining the intended message. Another misconception is that pyramids must hide endless secrets because the interior feels sparse. People expect grand chambers, hidden libraries, elaborate decoration, but the pyramid was not designed to be explored. It was designed to be secure. A small number of corridors and chambers is not disappointing in that context. It is logical. The grandeur was often expressed outside in temples, courtyards, reliefs, and ritual activity. The pyramid itself was the sealed anchor. And this brings us to one of the quietest misunderstandings of all: the idea that the pyramid's main purpose was to impress the living. It certainly did impress the living, but within Egyptian logic, the pyramid's function was not only social display. It was part of a system meant to keep the king's transition and ongoing presence correctly supported. The monument was built into a worldview where stability mattered, and where the correct relationship between humans, gods, and the king had practical consequences for how people felt the world would behave. In that worldview, maintaining order is not a poetic idea. It's a daily necessity. The Nile must rise and fall in season. The fields must yield. The state must manage grain. The temples must keep rituals. The king must remain legitimate. Pyramids are a stone expression of that legitimacy. Now, one reason misconceptions survive is that pyramids arrive to us in incomplete form. We see stripped surfaces, collapsed temples, broken causeways, sand-filled courtyards. We rarely see the intact system: the bright casing, the complete temples, the active storerooms, the staffed cult, the daily routine of offerings. Without that system, the pyramid feels like an isolated object. And isolated objects invite fantasy. But if you gently restore the missing context in your mind, the pyramid becomes less mysterious and more coherent. It becomes the center of a district, a place of ritual, a place supported by a workforce and an economy, a place with administrators, scribes, priests, and laborers. It becomes a project that a civilization could undertake because it had the organizational capacity to do so. There's another calm detail that helps. Pyramids are not only stone, they are also time. If you imagine thousands of people working for years, you begin to feel that the monument is not one action. It is a schedule. It is a controlled sequence that continues even when individuals rotate in and out. Some people quarry, some transport, some dress stone, some place blocks, some prepare food, some keep records, some treat injuries, some maintain ramps, some build temples. The pyramid is the sum of those roles. And once you accept that, the monument becomes more human, not less. It becomes a kind of frozen teamwork. So when myths appear about impossible precision, about alien machines, about hidden super technology, you can let them soften, because the real story is already strong enough. Human planning is impressive. Human patience is impressive. human ability to coordinate thousands of lives into one coherent project is impressive. And from here, we can drift into a quieter, more detailed look at a few specific building elements people often wonder about. How sledges likely worked on prepared paths, why water and lubrication might matter, what stone types tell us about transport networks, and how the rhythm of the Nile and the rhythm of labor could support a project that seems too vast until you remember it was built one day at a time. One of the simplest ways to make pyramid building feel realistic is to imagine the site as a place designed to reduce friction, literal friction, human friction, and logistical friction. When you move something extremely heavy, the difference between chaos and success often comes down to small advantages repeated many times. A smoother path, a better rope, a slightly better angle, a more consistent rhythm, a team that pulls together rather than out of step. Over years, tiny efficiencies become monumental. If you picture a stone block on a wooden sledge, the first thing you notice is that the sledge spreads weight and makes movement more predictable. Instead of trying to carry a block in the air, which is unstable and dangerous, you keep it low and stable. The second thing you notice is that the ground matters more than the force. A perfectly strong team will still struggle on soft, uneven sand. A less strong team can move a surprising load on a prepared surface. That's why preparation is as important as pulling. Paths could be compacted, leveled, and cleared. In places, they might be treated or maintained, so the sledge doesn't dig in. Even moisture can matter. A slightly dampened surface can reduce drag, and when drag is lower, movement becomes smoother and safer. Safety is not a modern luxury on a construction site. Safety is productivity. If a sledge tips or a block slips, you lose time, tools, and sometimes lives. A well-run site would treat stable hauling as one of its core priorities. Then there is the rhythm of teams. When many people pull together, the goal is not only maximum force, the goal is steady, coordinated force. A load that moves a little, reliably, is better than a load that jerks and stalls. Jerking breaks ropes and harms bodies. Steady motion preserves equipment and people. You can imagine a call and response pace, or a shared timing that keeps effort synchronized, especially on slopes where the risk of slipping increases. The pyramid's sloping form actually helps explain why building could proceed without impossible vertical lifting. The structure itself creates a rising environment. As courses are added, the working surface rises with them. Materials can be moved to staging areas at different levels. Temporary ramps can be extended, shifted, rebuilt, or dismantled. The ramp doesn't need to exist as one giant permanent object. It can be a changing set of solutions, adjusted as the pyramid grows. It's calm to think of ramps not as a single answer, but as a family of answers. Straight ramps, side ramps, wrapping ramps, internal or external approaches. Different projects and different phases could use different combinations. The key is that the builders didn't need one perfect method. They needed methods that worked well enough, day after day, without catastrophic failure. And once stone arrives near its placement zone, another quiet process begins: fitting. Even if a block is roughly shaped, its placement still requires decisions. How does it sit? What gaps remain? What needs trimming? What needs packing? In the core, blocks can be more irregular as long as they lock into a stable mass. On the outside, where casing would be placed, the demands change. Faces must align with the intended plane. Edges must meet cleanly. Corners must remain true. This is where skilled labor becomes especially visible, even if the finished surface hides the effort behind smoothness. When you imagine casing stones, imagine them as the final calm skin. They are not simply decorative, they are the pyramid's public face. They complete the geometry and make the structure read as a single, coherent idea. With casing intact, the pyramid communicates order immediately. Without casing, we see the working body underneath, which can look rougher because it was never meant to be the final visual statement. The casing also changes how the pyramid interacts with the sky. Smooth faces catch light in a unified way. Edges appear sharper. Shadows fall with clean geometry. In the morning and evening, the pyramid would have had a different mood depending on which face was lit and which was in shade. You can imagine a slow rotation of light through the day, as if the monument is quietly turning, even though it stands still. This visual power helps explain why the pyramid could serve political and religious functions at once. The monument doesn't need to speak, it simply dominates. It suggests that the king's authority is not temporary. It is built into the land. It also suggests that the state can make the land obey a plan. Quarries opened, stone moved, lines measured, labor coordinated. The pyramid becomes a visible proof of centralized capacity. But that centralized capacity always rests on something simpler: supplies, bread, beer, water, meat when available, vegetables, salt, fuel for fires, replacement ropes, wood for sledges, copper for tools. A large site is a hungry machine. It eats resources constantly. So behind every block placed, there is a quieter story of farms producing grain, administrators collecting it, boats transporting it, storehouses distributing it, and cooks turning it into food that keeps bodies working. This supply story is one of the best reasons to keep the Nile in your imagination. The river is the quiet engine of the entire system. It makes agriculture reliable enough to create surplus. It makes transport efficient enough to move heavy loads. It connects distant regions, like granite sources in the south, to construction sites in the north. Without the Nile, pyramid building becomes much harder to imagine. With the Nile, it becomes a long logistical project, supported by a stable natural system. And because the Nile has seasons, the work would also have seasons. Even if construction could proceed in many months, the balance between agricultural labor and construction labor could shift through the year. This opens up a calm way to imagine workforce management. Not necessarily an endless army working at maximum intensity at all times, but a system that can draw on labor when fields are less demanding, while relying on permanent skilled workers and administrators to maintain continuity. Now, if you picture the pyramid site as an organism, the quarry areas are like lungs taking in raw material. The transport routes are like arteries, moving stone and food. The workshops are like hands, shaping and repairing. The administrative spaces are like the nervous system, directing action. The temples are like the heart of meaning, maintaining ritual purpose. The pyramid itself is like the skeleton, the stable frame that remains when everything else changes. This organism idea also helps explain why pyramids are rarely alone. Officials' tombs cluster nearby because proximity to the royal monument had social and spiritual value. Worker areas exist nearby because distance wastes energy. Storage areas exist nearby because supplies must be accessible. Causeways and temples exist because ritual and function require structured space. The pyramid is the center, but the center needs a surrounding body to live. Over time, when that surrounding body fades, the pyramid remains, but the site becomes quieter in a different way. The active routine dissolves. The storerooms empty. The temples collapse. The causeways lose their purpose. The living settlement shifts elsewhere. And then the monument enters its long second life, the life of endurance and reinterpretation. In that second life, pyramids become vulnerable in a very practical way. Casing stones are valuable. They are already cut. They are already transported. They can be reused in buildings, walls, and repairs. Removing casing doesn't feel like sacrilege to every later community. Sometimes it feels like resource recovery. And as casing disappears, the pyramid's protective skin is gone. The exposed core begins to weather differently. Rainwater, rare but real, finds pathways. Wind works into cracks. Temperature changes expand and contract stone. The sharpness softens. Even so, the basic mass remains. And that remaining mass is why pyramids still dominate the imagination. They are not fragile monuments. They are monuments built to resist time through weight and geometry. From here, we can let the focus drift toward the smaller pyramids and the broader pyramid landscape, how Queen's pyramids and subsidiary pyramids relate to the main monument, why some pyramids were built as part of family and lineage planning, and how the pyramid site becomes not only a king's project, but a structured environment for a whole royal world. Around the great royal pyramids, there is often a quieter ring of smaller monuments. Subsidiary pyramids, Queen's pyramids, and related tombs that make the landscape feel less like a single statement and more like a structured royal world. These smaller pyramids can be easy to overlook because the main pyramid dominates the horizon, but they matter because they show how pyramid building was not only about one person, it was also about family, lineage, and the way a royal household was meant to continue in memory. At Giza, for example, the main pyramids are accompanied by smaller pyramids that are commonly associated with queens or close royal relatives. Their presence is not just decorative. It reflects status, proximity, and the idea that being close to the king's monument carried value in death as well as in life. Proximity means connection. Connection means remembrance. And remembrance, in Egyptian thought, is a kind of continued existence. If you imagine the plateau in its active period, you can picture these smaller pyramids as part of a carefully planned ensemble. The king's pyramid is the anchor, but the surrounding monuments help create a royal landscape that expresses hierarchy in stone. The main pyramid stands as the primary axis. The smaller ones echo it, like a chorus around a lead voice. Even without words, the arrangement communicates, this is the center, and these are the ones bound to the center. Subsidiary pyramids may also have had specific ritual functions, and in some cases, they might be linked to aspects of the king's spiritual identity, not only to family burials. Not every smaller pyramid is simply a mini king's pyramid. Some are parts of a larger religious system that can include symbolic burials, ritual spaces, and architectural elements designed to support ceremonies we only partly understand today. Nearby, there are also boat pits and other features that remind you how layered these sites were. Boats can be linked to travel in ritual imagination. Additional pits and structures can relate to storage or to ceremonial needs. The plateau becomes crowded with meaning, even if today it looks open and stripped. Then there are the tombs of high officials, often mastabas, arranged near the royal pyramids. These tombs form neighborhoods of the dead, with their own internal decoration and inscriptions, and they tell you something about power structures. People wanted to be near the king because the king's cult activity and monument would keep the area active. Being near activity increases the chance your own tomb will receive attention, offerings, and remembrance. Even in death, social networks mattered. This idea that monuments create zones of continued attention is one of the most practical ways to understand why elite burials cluster near royal ones. It's not only about prestige, it's about security and continuity. An active temple complex has staff, guards, supplies, and visitors. Those things make the area less forgotten. They also make it harder for a tomb to disappear into neglect quickly. Being near the center can be a kind of long-term protection, and that brings us back to the role of the mortuary cult. Pyramid complexes weren't meant to become empty. They were meant to be staffed. Offerings were meant to be repeated. Priests were meant to keep the rituals alive. Endowments were meant to keep the system supplied. When that worked, the pyramid complex could remain a living institution, not just a sealed tomb. But institutions depend on continuity. If political stability breaks down, if resources shift, if administrative attention moves, the cult can weaken. Once the cult weakens, the complex becomes quieter. Once it becomes quieter, it becomes vulnerable. That vulnerability doesn't appear suddenly. It appears gradually, like a lamp, dimming over years. Maintenance gets delayed, walls crack, stone becomes easier to take, tombs become easier to enter, and a landscape that was once full of controlled movement becomes a landscape full of gaps. Even so, the original planning can still be traced in the remains. Causeways continue to point toward their intended ends. Temple foundations mark the shapes of courtyards. Tomb fields preserve alignment patterns. The site retains a kind of memory. Archaeology reads that memory the way a careful person reads footprints, not as a perfect record, but as enough to reconstruct a quiet story. When you zoom out to Egypt as a whole, you realize that pyramid landscapes exist in multiple regions, not only at Giza. Saqqara, Dashur, Abusir, Meidum, and other sites each represent slightly different phases and choices. Some are more experimental, some are more refined, some reflect changes in resources or religious emphasis. Together they create a long map of how the idea of a pyramid could shift while still remaining recognizable. This is why the pyramid tradition feels both stable and evolving. The core shape is stable because it is structurally sound and symbolically powerful, but the surrounding details evolve because societies evolve. They change how they allocate resources, how they express religious meaning, and how they want to present power. Even within one era, differences can reflect personality and politics. A king with a long reign might complete a larger, more elaborate complex. A king with a shorter reign might leave a smaller or less finished monument. A king might choose a location that connects him to past rulers, or one that claims a new kind of presence in the landscape. These choices are political as well as spiritual. Monuments speak not only to gods, but to people, and there is something calm about accepting that. We don't have to flatten pyramids into one explanation. We can let them be what they are: architecture that lives at the intersection of belief, power, and practical engineering. If you want the story to feel even more grounded, the next gentle step is to drift into the materials themselves. Limestone types, quarry choices, and why some stones were reserved for particular spaces. Because material choices tell you what builders valued. They reveal where effort was concentrated, where durability was required, and how the state could mobilize distant resources to serve one central project. Stone choice is one of the quietest ways pyramids tell the truth about how they were built, because stone is never neutral. Different stones behave differently under tools, under weight, under heat, and under time. When you see limestone in one place and granite in another, you are seeing decisions about effort, durability, and meaning. Much of the pyramid landscape depends on limestone because limestone was abundant and workable in many regions of Egypt. But limestone isn't one single thing. It varies in hardness, in grain, in how cleanly it breaks, and in how it weathers. Builders would have known these differences through experience. They would learn which layers in a quarry produced stone that held a clean edge, and which layers produced stone better suited for internal mass. They would learn which stone made smoother faces, and which stone tended to crumble or fracture. Over years of building, these lessons become instinctive. In the heart of a large pyramid, the core stone doesn't need to be beautiful. It needs to be stable. It needs to sit in a way that contributes to a solid mass. A core block can be rougher and still do its job, but the outer layers, especially the casing, are different. Casing stone needs to meet tight joints, hold straight lines, and resist weathering more effectively. It also needs to look right. The pyramid's public face is not only structural, it is symbolic. A smooth, bright face announces order. That is why fine casing limestone mattered so much. When casing stones were intact, they turned the pyramid into a single, coherent plane. You can imagine sunlight sliding down the faces, the edges drawn sharply against the sky. You can imagine the monument being visible from far away, not as a pile of blocks, but as a luminous form that appears almost effortless from a distance. That is part of the pyramid's intended power. the work disappears into the finished geometry. Granite belongs to a different category of effort. It is harder, heavier, and more resistant. Working granite requires more persistence. Transporting granite requires more planning. Choosing granite for specific spaces therefore signals that those spaces mattered enough to justify the extra cost. In major pyramids, granite was often used in critical structural areas, like the burial chamber and the beams that needed to manage weight, because it can handle compression and wear differently than limestone. Whether the choice was purely practical or also symbolic, it still communicates priority. Granite says, this place must endure. Once you start thinking in terms of priority, you can read a pyramid like a map of concentrated effort. Where did the builders spend the most labor per square meter? Where did they demand the cleanest fit? Where did they choose the hardest material? Where did they allow roughness? These patterns show you that pyramid building was not a blunt act of stacking. It was controlled allocation of skill and time. The quarry story is part of this control. Quarries are not just holes in the ground. They are production sites. They require organization, worker housing or temporary camps, tool supply, and transport routes. To run a quarry, you need systems. To run multiple quarries feeding one pyramid site, you need even more systems. That means pyramids are also monuments to regional coordination. Stone moving across distances, planned in advance, arriving in sequences that keep construction from stalling. Transport routes themselves shape the project. Stone from nearby sources can arrive steadily, while stone from distant sources may arrive in planned batches, timed with river conditions. Granite from the south is a good example of long-distance planning. The state must organize extraction, shape blocks enough for transport, load them securely, move them along water, unload them, stage them, and bring them into the construction flow. Each step requires people who know their roles and repeat them reliably. This is why the Nile never leaves the pyramid story. The river is the quiet conveyor belt of the kingdom. It turns a long distance into a manageable route. It lets heavy materials travel with less effort than hauling them over land alone. It connects the monument to the entire country because the pyramid isn't only built from local labor. It's built from national capacity. When you imagine the riverside of pyramid building, you can picture boats with cargo, docks or landing areas near valley temples, and storage zones where stone and supplies are staged. You can picture scribes marking deliveries, counting blocks, noting quality, and allocating materials to the right work areas. In a large project, it matters that the right stone reaches the right place. A granite beam meant for a critical chamber cannot be replaced casually by whatever happens to arrive. The pyramid becomes a system where planning prevents waste. And then once stone reaches the building zone, the most delicate part begins, placing it correctly, course after course, so the entire mass behaves predictably. Stones are heavy, and heavy things behave honestly. They settle where they are placed. They press into weaker points. They reveal flaws in planning. This is why careful placement and careful checking are so important. The pyramid doesn't forgive careless stacking. It might not collapse immediately, but it will crack, shift, or create long-term vulnerabilities. This is also why the builder's habit of incremental work is so comforting to imagine. A pyramid is not one dramatic risk. It is many small risks managed. Each course is checked. Each corner is watched. Each face is corrected. And because the pyramid is built as a layered form, builders can evaluate progress constantly. The monument itself becomes feedback. There is another quiet detail in material choice: mortar. Mortar is often misunderstood in pyramid talk. It is not what holds the pyramid together in the way cement holds modern bricks. The pyramid's stability comes mainly from mass and placement. Mortar can help fill gaps, stabilize fit, and distribute pressure more evenly in small ways, but the structure is not glued together. This matters because it keeps our imagination grounded. The pyramid is stable because it is heavy and well arranged, not because it relies on hidden binding magic. And when you think about the pyramid as a heavy arrangement, you can understand why builders cared so much about slope and internal planning. The pyramid's own weight is both its greatest strength and its greatest challenge. Weight creates stability, but weight also creates pressure. A chamber in the wrong place or with the wrong support becomes a weakness under that pressure. So internal design is always an argument with gravity, and gravity always has the final word. This returns us to the calm genius of certain interior choices: corbelling to manage spanning, relieving spaces to redirect load, granite beams to strengthen critical points. These are not mysteries. They are answers to a consistent question. How do you keep stone from crushing the space you need to keep open? And because those answers are practical, they can be learned, shared, and improved. That is one reason pyramids form a tradition rather than a single miracle. The knowledge becomes institutional. It is passed on. It is refined. The next project begins with lessons already learned. Now, once you hold on to that idea, pyramids as institutional knowledge made visible, you can begin to appreciate the later variations even more. Later pyramids that look less perfect are not necessarily the result of ignorance. They can reflect different constraints: less available high-quality stone, different political stability, different decisions about where to concentrate resources, different religious emphasis. The tradition continues, but it does so under changing conditions. And that changing condition is another calm truth of history. Nothing stays at peak intensity forever. A society's monumental style shifts with its economy, its politics, and its worldview. Pyramids are a peak of one phase, but not the only expression of Egyptian complexity. From here, the next natural drift is to move into how pyramids were experienced by later people, how ancient visitors, later Egyptians, and foreign travelers interpreted them, how stories grew, and how modern archaeology slowly replaced legend with measured understanding. Because pyramids don't only belong to their builders, they belong to everyone who stood before them afterward and tried in their own way to explain what they were seeing. As soon as pyramids were old enough to feel distant, they began to collect new meanings from new eyes. That process is almost inevitable. A monument built for one worldview will be reinterpreted when the worldview changes, and the pyramid is especially vulnerable to reinterpretation because it is both simple and massive. It doesn't explain itself in words. It just stands there, silent, and silence invites stories. Even within Egypt, later generations would have looked back at the Great Pyramid Age as a kind of deep past. The original builders were gone. The original political conditions were gone. Some of the original rituals would have changed, moved, or faded, yet the pyramids remained, still dominant on their plateaus. That creates a particular psychological effect. The feeling that the ancestors lived in a different scale of time, a different scale of power, a different closeness to the gods. When later people feel that distance, they often respond with reverence, curiosity, and sometimes with myth-making. You can imagine ancient visitors arriving at a pyramid site and experiencing something we still experience today: the sense that the monument is too large to fully hold in the mind at once. The edges look clean from far away. The stones look chaotic up close. The structure seems simple, and yet refuses to feel simple. That tension is one of the reasons pyramids became wonders in later storytelling traditions. A pyramid feels like it has one idea, and that one idea is so large it becomes difficult to believe it was executed by ordinary hands. At the same time, later visitors would also have encountered ruins, not pristine complexes. They might see stripped faces, collapsed temples, broken causeways, and openings created by earlier robbers or later explorers. And ruin creates a different kind of imagination than completeness. A complete system tells you what it is. A broken system forces you to guess. If you arrive at a pyramid and the surrounding temples are fragmented, the ritual logic becomes harder to see, and the monument starts to feel like an isolated enigma. That is one reason myths become louder over time. as the context disappears, the object remains, and the gap between object and explanation widens. Into that gap, human imagination pours. People invent hidden chambers, secret libraries, strange machines, lost sciences. These stories say more about the storyteller's needs than about the pyramid. They are attempts to match the monument's emotional weight with an explanation that feels equally heavy, but the calm approach is to let the emotional weight come from the truth instead. The truth is already large enough. The pyramid is a human achievement, supported by a whole society, sustained over years, built by coordinated labor, and anchored in a worldview that treated order as sacred. That is not a small story. It just isn't a dramatic fantasy story. Modern archaeology shifts the pyramid's meaning again, not by removing wonder, but by changing where the wonder lives. Instead of wonder in mystery, the wonder becomes wonder in evidence, tool marks, quarry traces, settlement remains, burial patterns, temple foundations, transport routes, administrative records. Each of these is a small piece of reality, and reality has a quiet power when enough pieces align. One of the most gentle lessons archaeology offers is that the simplest explanations usually fit best when they match the full range of evidence. If a theory explains the pyramid's height but cannot explain the work or settlement, it is incomplete. If a theory explains the stone fit but cannot explain quarry logistics, it is incomplete. The strength of the practical human story is that it can incorporate everything: agriculture, transport, labor organization, tool use, structural design, religious function, and long-term maintenance. And as those pieces come together, the pyramids begin to feel less like isolated miracles and more like landmarks in a long technological and administrative tradition. You can trace experimentation in shape. You can trace increasing confidence in construction. You can trace changes in how temples and inscriptions were emphasized. You can trace shifting materials and methods. In other words, you can see the pyramid tradition behaving like real human history: gradual, uneven, adaptive. At the same time, modern attention brings a new layer of meaning: national identity, tourism, global fascination, and the modern habit of treating ancient monuments as symbols of civilization itself. Pyramids become shorthand for ancient, for mysterious, for eternal. They appear in logos, films, and metaphors. They become part of global imagination, not only Egyptian history. This modern layer is not automatically wrong. Symbols have their own life, but it can be calming to remember that the pyramid's original life was not symbolic in an abstract sense. It was functional within a worldview. It had staff, it had stores, it had rituals, it had daily routines, it had smells and sounds and dust and repairs. It was a living institution for a time, and then it became a long-lived ruin. And ruins have their own truth. A ruin is not an object that failed. A ruin is an object that outlasted its original system. In that way, the pyramid's ruin is almost a compliment. It means the stone remained after the economy, the cult, and the political structure that created it shifted into something else. If you want the pyramid story to stay calm and grounded, it helps to keep returning to the simplest, stable image: the pyramid as a project. A project planned, funded, managed, completed, maintained, then slowly altered by time. The project begins with quarry decisions and labor plans. It grows through daily routines and repeated measurement. It ends with casing and temples completed, ceremonies performed, offerings begun. Then it enters its second life as an old monument, then its third life as a ruin, and then its fourth life as a global symbol. Each life adds a layer of interpretation, but the stone remains the same stone, and gravity remains the same gravity. Now, to keep our pace gentle, we can move into a particularly soothing kind of detail: the way pyramids interact with light and direction, and how that interaction may have mattered to the builders. Because pyramids are not only objects in space, They are objects in sunlight, objects in shadow, objects under a sky that was central to Egyptian imagination. And when you begin to notice how a pyramid face brightens, darkens, and holds the day's movement, the monument starts to feel less like a riddle and more like a slow instrument, measuring time without a clock, simply by being a shape that the sun cannot ignore. A pyramid is one of the clearest shapes you can place under the sun, because the faces are broad and flat, and because the edges are sharp. Light behaves on a pyramid in a way that feels almost intentional. The monument turns the sky into a slow performance of brightness and shadow. And in a culture like ancient Egypt, where the sun was not only a source of warmth, but a major symbol of order and life, that daily performance would have carried meaning. Imagine the pyramid at dawn. One face begins to catch the first light, while the others remain in shade. The edge line between light and dark is crisp and calm. As the sun climbs, the shadow shifts in a steady, predictable way. The pyramid doesn't move, but it makes movement visible. The day draws itself across the stone. This is one reason pyramids feel so timeless. They don't show the details of a single era, the way a decorated temple wall might. They show a relationship between geometry and nature that is always true. Sunlight behaves the same way today that it did then. Shadows still slide in the same direction. The pyramid, simply by existing, makes time feel steady. Orientation matters here too. When a pyramid is carefully aligned with the cardinal directions, its faces relate to the sun's path in a controlled way. The east face greets morning light. The west face receives the late day. The south and north faces experience the day differently depending on the season. In a sense, a pyramid is built into the compass of the world. It becomes a stable reference, a fixed point that makes the sky feel ordered. Egyptian religion placed great importance on the sun's cycle, its rising, its journey, its setting, and its return. The daily rhythm of light and darkness was not only a physical fact, it was a pattern of renewal. When you look at a pyramid through that lens, the monument's relationship to light begins to look less accidental and more appropriate. A pyramid is a stable, permanent form that catches the sun every day. It becomes part of the visual language of renewal. The sun returns, the light returns, order returns. This is also why the bright casing stone makes such a difference to imagination. A rough core absorbs light differently. It breaks the face into irregular patches of shadow. But a smooth, pale casing turns the entire face into one plane of reflection. That plane would have made the monument look cleaner, brighter, more unified, almost like a deliberate mirror of the sky's clarity. Now imagine the pyramid at midday, when light is harsh and shadows are shorter. The form becomes less dramatic in shadow, but more absolute in brightness. Edges still define the shape. The pyramid's mass feels strongest then because it seems to take light without changing its expression. In the late afternoon, as shadows lengthen, the pyramid becomes dramatic again. One face glows warm, another darkens, and the edges become lines of contrast. The monument's geometry is re-emphasized by the day's softening light. In a sleep-friendly way, this daily movement is comforting. It suggests that even the largest human-made structures are still part of natural cycles. The pyramid does not escape the sun. It participates in it. The monument becomes a kind of calm instrument for seeing the day pass. This relationship between monument and sky also connects to the Egyptian interest in stars, especially the circumpolar stars that never set. To ancient observers, these stars could symbolize stability and permanence. A pyramid aligned toward the north becomes aligned toward that concept of permanence. Whether the builders were thinking in terms of specific star alignments or broader directional symbolism, the key is that direction mattered. A pyramid was placed as if it belonged to the sky as much as to the land. This makes the pyramid feel less like an isolated tomb and more like a bridge. Earth below, sky above, stone connecting the two. The shape itself, wide at the ground, narrowing toward the top, seems to enact that bridging idea. It is a mountain made by humans, but it also resembles a ray of light turned into matter. It can be read in more than one symbolic direction, and that flexibility is part of why it remains powerful. Now, if you gently widen your view, you can also notice how pyramids relate to the broader horizon. They are placed on plateaus for visibility, and visibility has meaning. A pyramid that can be seen from the valley is not only a grave marker, it is a statement to the living. The king is present, the king is enduring, the king's order is still anchored in stone. This visibility helps explain why location is so carefully chosen. The pyramid is placed where it can speak through sight. At the same time, the plateau's openness means the pyramid is also exposed. Wind moves freely, dust drifts across surfaces, rare rains fall without much shelter. Temperature swings between day and night. Over a long time, these exposures shape the stone. They soften edges, widen cracks, and wear surfaces. In that sense, the pyramid is constantly being rewritten by the environment, but so slowly that the rewriting feels like a gentle whisper rather than a sharp change. This slow environmental writing is part of why pyramids feel calm. They teach you to think in long time. A modern building can change in a decade. A pyramid changes across centuries. In front of that time scale, ordinary worries begin to feel smaller, and yet the pyramid is not purely natural. It is a human geometry in a natural world. That tension is why it can feel both peaceful and uncanny. It is as if a human mind took the desert's emptiness and placed a perfect thought into it. From here, we can drift into another calm layer of pyramid life. The way pyramids were surrounded by texts, names, and images, sometimes not on the pyramid itself, but on temples and tombs nearby. Because the pyramid may be visually simple, but the world around it could be rich with carved meaning. In reliefs, inscriptions, and titles, we can hear the voices of the society that built these monuments, what they valued, how they described themselves, how they imagined the king's role, and how they tied everyday work to cosmic purpose. If the pyramid itself is a quiet shape, the surrounding inscriptions, where they survive, are often where the civilization speaks most clearly. Egyptian monuments are filled with names and titles, with carefully chosen words meant to last. And in Egyptian thought, words lasting in stone is not just communication, it is preservation. A carved name is a kind of continued presence. Near pyramid complexes, the tombs of officials can be especially revealing. These tombs might include reliefs showing daily life, agriculture, fishing, craft work, food preparation, boat travel, and scenes of offering. To modernize, these images can feel like decoration, but for ancient Egyptians, they could serve multiple roles: status display, ritual support, and a kind of inventory of life. The scenes show what mattered, what was expected, and what the tomb owner wanted to carry forward symbolically. The names and titles carved near these scenes also matter. Titles are not only job descriptions, they are signals of proximity to power, of responsibilities held, and of social identity. When you see an official described with titles tied to the king's household, the treasury, the granaries, or temple administration, you're seeing how the state's machinery worked. And because pyramid building depends on that machinery, these titles are indirectly part of the pyramid story as well. You can imagine a world where a person's identity is partly built from the roles they served. Overseer of, keeper of, scribe of. These are not casual labels. They are marks of inclusion in the state's order. When these titles are carved in stone, they become part of the person's long-term existence. The way Egyptians hoped existence could be extended through remembrance. In some pyramids, the focus shifts inward, and the walls of chambers themselves begin to carry extensive texts. The pyramid texts are a major example. They are not written as a single story with a plot. They are collections of utterances, statements, protections, and guidance meant to support the dead king's journey and transformation. They can speak of ascent, of joining the gods, of becoming among the stars, of being protected from dangers. In that sense, they function like a ritual toolkit carved into stone so it cannot be lost. What is calming about this is that it shows continuity between practical tools and spiritual tools. A copper chisel shapes limestone. A carved utterance shapes the king's afterlife, at least in the logic of the culture. Both are considered effective when performed correctly. Both require knowledge. Both are part of order. Even when pyramid interiors are not heavily inscribed, the temple environment often was. Temples could include reliefs, inscriptions, and symbolic scenes that framed the pyramid complex within a larger religious narrative. And because temples were places of repeated ritual action, the words and images there were meant to be encountered again and again. Repetition reinforces belief. Belief reinforces order. Order sustains the institution. Names on monuments also tell you something else: how intensely Egyptians valued memory. To be forgotten was a kind of loss. To be remembered was a kind of survival. That is why we see so much attention paid to the maintenance of names. On tomb walls, on stelae, on statues, the pyramid, as the largest and most visible kind of royal monument, becomes a giant statement of remembering, not only for the king, but for the system the king represented. This love of naming also helps explain why later damage to names could be so powerful. In some periods of political conflict or religious change, names could be erased or altered as an act of removing a person from the remembered order. That tells you how real remembrance felt to people. It wasn't a polite gesture, it was tied to existence. If you let this sink in, you begin to understand the pyramid complex as an environment designed to keep memory active. The pyramid anchors the memory physically. The temples enact the memory through ritual. The inscriptions keep the memory present through language. The nearby tombs participate by clustering around the royal center, hoping to share in the stability and attention the center creates. And then as centuries pass and those systems weaken, the relationship between stone and memory changes. The pyramid remains, but the living routine of naming and offering fades. The monument becomes a silent object again, still carrying names in some places, but no longer surrounded by a community that speaks those names daily. This is one reason pyramids can feel haunting. They were built for a world of active remembrance, and we encounter them in a world where that remembrance is mostly gone. Modern archaeology and epigraphy try to bring some of those voices back, not by reviving the ancient cult, but by reading what remains. When we translate titles, record inscriptions, map tomb scenes, and document temple fragments, we are, in a different way, participating in the ancient system of remembering. We are speaking names again. We are placing identities back into a narrative of human history, rather than leaving them as anonymous stone. That is another calm reason pyramids feel powerful today. They connect us to people who wanted to be remembered. The desire is recognizable. The method is different. But the impulse is familiar. And if you want a soothing place to go next, we can drift into the question of measurement and numbers, not as cold statistics, but as gentle perspective. Approximate dimensions, the scale of blocks, the time required, the organization implied, because sometimes the easiest way to calm the mind is to replace vague astonishment with clear scale. Clear scale turns mystery into understanding, and understanding can feel like quiet. Scale is one of the most calming things to hold in your mind when thinking about pyramids, because clear scale replaces vague amazement with something steadier. When you know roughly how big something is, and you can imagine it in relation to the human body, the monument becomes less like a fantasy object and more like an enormous but understandable project. A pyramid is built from units, blocks, courses, workdays, teams. When people say, "It's too big," what they often mean is that they cannot picture the unit-by-unit accumulation. But that accumulation is exactly how the pyramid exists. It is not one act, it is a count of acts. Start with the base. The base of a major pyramid is wide enough that if you stood at one corner and looked toward the far corner, the distance would feel like a long walk. That walk matters because it reminds you that leveling and squaring the base is not a small preliminary task. It is a major job, likely requiring repeated checking over a large area. A base isn't simply made level, it is maintained as level through careful process. Then think about height. A pyramid becomes visually dominant not only because it is tall, but because its sides rise with continuous planes. Unlike a tower, which is narrow, a pyramid uses width to amplify the impression of height. The eye reads the whole face at once. It's a broad climb. That broad climb is what makes the monument feel like a mountain. Now think about blocks. Not every block is the same size, and not every block is the same quality. Some are massive, some are more manageable, many are roughly shaped for core placement. What matters is that each block has to be extracted, moved, and placed. That is where time becomes the true building material. If a project lasts years and hundreds or thousands of blocks can be moved and placed in a day across a large coordinated workforce, the total can become enormous without requiring impossible daily performance. This is the gentle logic of large ancient construction. Scale comes from sustained routine. When people try to imagine pyramid construction, they sometimes imagine one small group doing everything. That makes the job feel impossible. But the pyramid is not built by one group. It is built by many groups doing different tasks in parallel. Quarry teams extract stone. Dressing teams shape stone. Transport teams move stone. Ramp teams maintain paths. Placement teams position blocks. Tool teams repair copper and wood. Food teams cook. Water teams distribute. Scribes record. Supervisors coordinate. Priests maintain ritual spaces. Guards watch stores. The pyramid rises because the whole machine runs. Once you picture parallel work, the timeline begins to make sense. The pyramid is not waiting for one task to finish before another begins. It is a flow. While blocks are being placed on one side, more blocks are being cut. While casing stones are being prepared, temple walls can rise. While internal spaces are being finished, external work continues. The site is not one line of action. It is many lines. This parallelism also makes the pyramid feel more human. It turns the project into something like a city at work. Many people doing many jobs, each contributing a small piece to a larger outcome. The pyramid is the visible sum of invisible specialization. Now, if you want a calming numerical perspective, consider the basic arithmetic of routine. If a workforce can place a certain number of blocks per day, and the work continues across many months and years, the total becomes large. The exact numbers vary by pyramid, by block type, and by method, and we don't need to lock ourselves into one precise figure to understand the principle. What matters is that a large total does not require one impossible day. It requires thousands of ordinary days. This is a valuable point for the mind in general. Large achievements often look like miracles from a distance because we see the finished result. But most large achievements are the product of routine maintained over time. Pyramids simply make that truth visible on a grand scale. There is another aspect of scale that is often overlooked: the scale of supporting infrastructure. A pyramid site needs storage for food and tools. It needs housing. It needs routes. It needs areas where stone can be staged. It needs workshops. If you imagine the site as a working district, you begin to feel its real footprint. The pyramid is the tallest object, but not the only object. The plateau would have had a whole pattern of activity laid across it, and much of that pattern is now faint or broken. Scale also explains why finishing work mattered so much. The last stages, casing, temple finishing, smoothing, alignment correction, are what transform a working construction site into a finished monument. Without finishing, the pyramid would feel incomplete. With finishing, it becomes a clean statement. And because the statement is so bold, finishing likely carried political and religious importance. A smooth pyramid face says, the project did not fail. The king's order was carried through to completion. Now, when you think of pyramids in different periods, scale shifts. Later pyramids often reduce size, but may increase text and interior emphasis. In some cases, the temple decoration becomes more elaborate. In other cases, different tomb styles take precedence. This is another way scale helps. It prevents us from treating history as a single ladder, where bigger always means better. Societies choose different expressions at different times. A smaller pyramid can still carry deep meaning. A different tomb type can still be richly supported. And yet the Great Pyramids remain special because they sit at an intersection of maximum scale and strong central organization. They are not only big, they are coherent. They are aligned. They are finished. They are surrounded by planned complexes. That combination is rare. If you want to keep the mood steady, the next step is to look at time as it would be felt by an individual worker. Not time as a grand timeline, but time as lived, waking, eating, working, resting, repeating. Because when you bring the story down to a single day repeated over years, the pyramid becomes less overwhelming. It becomes the background of many ordinary lives. People who did not wake up thinking they were building a wonder, but who woke up thinking about today's task, today's tools, today's ration, and the steady rhythm that carried the whole monument forward without needing any single dramatic moment. Imagine the pyramid not from the air, not from a postcard distance, but from the height of a person who is living beside it. From that height, the monument doesn't appear all at once. It appears in pieces. A wall you walk past, a ramp you climb, a block you touch, a corner line you check, a shadow that falls differently as the months pass. The pyramid becomes part of the horizon of daily life, like a mountain that is still growing. A day would begin with simple needs. Water first, because the plateau is dry and the body is honest about thirst. Food next, because heavy work demands calories. The day's work would be assigned not in a dramatic speech, but in practical instruction. Where to quarry, where to haul, which tools to bring, which group to join, which section of ramp needs repair, which staging area needs clearing. The instructions would repeat across days, changing only in detail as the monument rises. The work itself would include long stretches of steady motion, pulling, carrying, guiding, clearing, adjusting. This is the kind of work where rhythm matters. A team pulling a sledge learns to breathe together, to lean at the same time, to keep tension steady so the rope doesn't snap. If you picture that rhythm, you can picture the pyramid rising through coordination rather than brute force. Even skilled tasks have their own rhythms. Stone dressing is not frantic. It is controlled. A person chips, checks, chips, checks. A person rubs with abrasive, checks flatness, rubs again. A person tests fit against a neighboring surface. Over time, the hands become trained to feel the difference between good enough and needs more work. In a calm sense, pyramid building trains attention. There would be moments of fatigue, because fatigue is part of heavy work, but there would also be moments of competence, when a difficult block moves cleanly, when a course aligns correctly, when a corner line remains true. Those moments matter because they create pride and reinforce routine. A large project survives when people feel that their work has a purpose and that the system around them is stable enough to keep rewarding effort with progress. Rest would come in shade when possible, because shade is a kind of relief in a bright landscape. At midday, the heat changes how everything feels. Stone stores warmth. Dust becomes fine and persistent. The body becomes slower. The mind narrows to what is necessary. A well-managed site would adapt, shifting tasks, allowing rest, maintaining water distribution, because wasted bodies waste projects. Even if the ancient world was harsh by modern standards, the logic of maintaining a workforce is timeless. Then the day moves toward evening, and the light changes again. The pyramid's faces shift in color. Shadows lengthen. Work becomes less punishing. Tools are gathered. Teams return. Food is prepared again. The body, which has been part of the project all day, returns to being simply a body, wanting rest, wanting relief, wanting sleep. If you imagine living in a worker settlement near the plateau, you can imagine small rooms, shared spaces, the smell of cooking, the sound of conversation. People would talk about ordinary things: family, injuries, plans, rumors, supervisors, rations, the river, the weather. The pyramid might come up sometimes, but likely not as a mystical object. It would be the work, the thing that shapes their week. Monumentality can become normal when you live beside it. This normalizing is important. Modern viewers see pyramids as singular wonders, but builders would have experienced them as long-term projects, serious, demanding, but also structured. The extraordinary becomes ordinary through repetition. That is one reason pyramids could be built at all. Over months and years, the pyramid's growth would create new routines. Ramps shift upward, staging areas move. The distance from quarry to placement zone changes. Tasks rotate. Injuries happen and some heal. New workers arrive, others leave. The project remains the constant, like a heartbeat. And then at some point, the project reaches a different kind of work: finishing. Finishing changes the mood. The structure stops being only a construction site and starts becoming a completed statement. Casing stones must be fitted. Edges must be crisp. Lines must be clean. Temples must be completed. Courtyards must be arranged. The site must look and behave like a sacred complex, not like a raw work zone. Finishing is often where the most visible precision appears, because finishing is what the world will judge. The core can be practical. The finished face must be convincing. And in a civilization that tied royal monuments to cosmic order, convincing is not a superficial concern. The pyramid must look ordered because it represents order. After completion, the site changes again. The large construction labor force would diminish. The focus shifts to ritual staff, maintenance, administration of offerings, management of temple resources. The monument enters its institutional life. For the people who remain, the pyramid is no longer rising. It is simply there, like a permanent presence. This long process, construction, completion, cult maintenance, gradual decline, creates a layered timeline that helps explain why pyramids feel so deep in history. They were not built in a moment and then abandoned. They lived in multiple phases. And because the stone remains, we can still feel those phases faintly, even if we only see the traces. If you want a softer and more reflective drift next, we can move into the afterlife of pyramids in the landscape. How sand and wind slowly reshape their surroundings. How temples disappear first. How casing removal changes erosion patterns. And how the pyramid becomes a kind of time capsule. Not because it seals secrets, but because it sits in one place, long enough for history to gather around it. Over long time, the pyramid site becomes quieter, but it doesn't become static. The desert is always moving, even when it looks still. Wind carries fine particles that settle and lift again. Sand drifts into low places and pulls away from high places. Stones heat and cool, expanding and contracting in tiny cycles. Rare rain runs along the easiest pathways and disappears quickly, leaving behind subtle erosion that accumulates over centuries. The pyramid is solid, but the environment is patient. When a pyramid complex is newly built and actively maintained, the landscape is controlled. Paths are kept clear. Courtyards are swept. Walls are repaired. Temples are staffed. The presence of people holds the site in a certain shape. But when maintenance fades, control fades too. Sand begins to collect in corners. Rubble piles grow where a wall collapses. Weeds can appear near the edges where moisture gathers. A processional route becomes less distinct. The site becomes less like architecture and more like geology. The first elements to disappear are often the ones that were never meant to endure in the same way as the pyramid's mass. Temporary structures vanish. Wooden parts decay. Mud brick elements erode quickly compared to stone. Even stone temples can break down faster than the pyramid because they have thinner walls, more exposed edges, and less mass-resisting weather. The pyramid is built like a mountain. The temple is built like a building. And buildings are easier to dismantle. Then comes the slow, human process of reuse. A pyramid complex contains high-quality stone in convenient shapes. For later builders, especially those living nearby, this stone is a resource. They don't need to quarry it. They don't need to transport it from far away. It is already cut and placed in the landscape. If a city needs rebuilding, if a wall needs strengthening, if a new structure is planned, old stone can become the easiest supply. This reuse process often begins with the most valuable stones, casing stones. Casing limestone is fine quality, smooth, and already shaped for clean faces. It is perfect for reuse, so the pyramid loses its skin first. The bright, smooth planes that define the original geometry are peeled away. And once that skin is removed, the pyramid's relationship with the environment changes. A smooth face sheds dust and water differently than a rough stepped face. A smooth face makes fewer pockets where sand can rest. A smooth face offers fewer gaps for wind to work into. When the casing is gone, the exposed core becomes more vulnerable. Water can find seams more easily. Wind can place sand into gaps. Temperature changes can widen existing fractures. The pyramid begins to weather at a faster pace, not because it is suddenly weak, but because its protective finish is gone. And yet, even in this stripped state, the pyramid remains coherent. It remains a pyramid. This is one of the most important points about the design. The core is not a fragile shell. It is the monument's main body. The casing was a skin that completed the message, but the mass beneath carries the structure. That's why pyramids can lose so much and still stand. As the site becomes quieter, the stories around it often become louder. People see the damaged monument and imagine it must have once been more mysterious than it was. In a way, ruin invites overinterpretation. Gaps look like secrets. Broken corridors look like evidence of hidden systems. Unfinished surfaces look like clues. This is where legends grow, because legend feeds on incomplete evidence. But archaeology works in the opposite direction. Archaeology treats ruin as information. A missing casing stone is not a mystery. It is a historical event. A broken temple wall is not an omen. It is a sequence of collapse and reuse. A widened entrance is not a portal. It is a record of human activity after the monument's original life. The calm approach is to see the site as layered history rather than as a single puzzle. If you imagine walking a pyramid site centuries after it was built, you might see small signs of later presence, graffiti, small shrines, reused stones in nearby structures, paths that cut across older sacred routes. The pyramid becomes a landmark used for orientation, a place people visit, a place people climb, a place people mine. The monument is too big to ignore, so it becomes part of whatever world exists around it. And then eventually, the pyramid enters the modern period, where a new kind of attention arrives: systematic measurement, excavation, mapping, and preservation. Modern archaeology does not simply discover pyramids. Pyramids were never hidden in the way a buried city might be. But archaeology discovers contexts, worker settlements, harbor areas, temple plans, cemetery patterns, tool remains, and administrative traces. Each discovery shifts the pyramid story away from myth and back toward lived reality. The modern period also changes the site physically. Excavation clears sand, tourism creates paths, preservation decisions are made. The site becomes managed again, but managed for a different purpose. Instead of being maintained as an active ritual complex, it is maintained as a heritage landscape. That changes the relationship between monument and visitor. Visitors arrive not as participants in a cult, but as observers, learners, and pilgrims of curiosity. And because visitors come from everywhere, the pyramid becomes a global symbol more strongly than ever. It appears in books, films, and metaphors. It becomes shorthand for ancient genius, for mystery, for endurance. In some ways, this is another phase of the pyramid's long life, the symbolic life that travels far beyond Egypt's plateau. But there is a quieter truth beneath all symbolism. The pyramid is still what it always was: stone, arranged with intention, shaped by human hands, resting under the same sky that watched it rise. If you strip away myth, the monument doesn't become smaller. It becomes more intimate. It becomes an object that carries the labor of thousands of ordinary people forward through time. This intimacy is one of the most calming ways to think about pyramids. Not as monuments that separate us from the past, but as monuments that connect us to it. The people who built them wanted stability, wanted continuity, wanted their world to hold together. Those desires are not alien, they are familiar. The pyramid is an ancient answer to a human need we still recognize: the wish for something solid. From here, we can move into a gentle comparison that helps many listeners: the difference between pyramid building and other Egyptian monument styles, especially temples and rock-cut tombs, and why Egypt shifted toward those other forms in later periods. Because understanding that shift makes pyramids feel less like an isolated obsession and more like one chapter in a long architectural conversation that Egypt held with itself over thousands of years. If you place pyramids inside the longer arc of Egyptian architecture, they begin to feel less like a single extraordinary obsession and more like one phase in a changing conversation. Egypt did not build only pyramids, and it did not abandon the monument building when pyramid construction declined. Instead, the emphasis shifted. Different kinds of monuments rose to prominence: temples with vast courtyards, pylons, and columns, and tombs cut into cliffs, hidden in valleys, richly decorated inside. The ambition remained. The expression changed. A pyramid is an architecture of mass. Its strength is its weight and its geometry. It is meant to be seen from far away, and it is meant to endure by being too heavy to fail easily. Its interior is limited because the whole concept depends on leaving most of the structure solid. A temple, by contrast, is an architecture of space. It creates rooms and pathways, columns and roofs, courtyards and halls, where people can move, gather, and perform rituals in a structured sequence. A temple is less about a single shape on the horizon and more about guiding the body through an experience. This difference matters because it hints at shifting religious and political priorities. Pyramid complexes included temples, but the pyramid itself was still the central statement. In later periods, temples become even more central as living religious institutions. Large state temples drew resources, staff, offerings, and royal attention. They became places where kings displayed legitimacy through building, decoration, and endowment. The temple became a stage where the relationship between king and gods could be renewed publicly and repeatedly. Rock-cut tombs are another shift. Instead of building a mountain of stone above ground, a tomb can be cut into the living rock of a cliff. The landscape becomes the monument. This has practical advantages. The rock itself provides protection. The entrance can be concealed or defended more easily than a towering pyramid face. The interior space can be expanded and richly decorated without requiring a vast mass of stone above it. A rock-cut tomb becomes an architecture of interior meaning. scenes, texts, and symbolic journeys painted or carved onto walls. If pyramids express order through shape, many later tombs express order through narrative and imagery. They become journeys painted in corridors, maps of the afterlife, representations of gods, and records of offerings. The shift is not from religion to non-religion. It is a shift in how religious meaning is housed, less in a single, enormous external shape, more in an interior world of text and image. There is also a political logic to these shifts. Large pyramids are expensive, and they require a particular kind of central authority to sustain them. If political power becomes more distributed, or if resources must be directed elsewhere, toward temples, armies, administration, or broader infrastructure, then monument styles that concentrate meaning without concentrating mass can become more attractive. A rock-cut tomb can be grand without requiring the same national-scale logistics as a giant pyramid. A temple can centralize royal presence in a city where people gather, rather than on a plateau where the monument stands mostly alone. This doesn't mean pyramids failed as an idea. It means that the state's priorities, economy, and religious emphasis shifted, and architecture shifted with them. History doesn't move like a straight ladder, where one form replaces another because it is better. Forms change because societies change. And yet, pyramids remain a reference point even when they are no longer the dominant style. Later Egyptian rulers still looked back at the Pyramid Age. The memory of those monuments remained powerful. It shaped how people thought about kingship and permanence. The pyramid became part of Egypt's own deep past, a kind of architectural ancestor. There is something soothing in that. Even ancient Egyptians experienced their own history as layered. They lived with monuments built by people who were already ancient to them. They walked among old stones the way we do now. They felt the weight of time the way we do now. In that sense, pyramids have always been time machines, not because they move, but because they hold multiple eras in one place. And if you return to the pyramid itself, after considering temples and rock-cut tombs, you can see more clearly what the pyramid offered that other forms did not. It offered a single overwhelming shape, an external certainty. It offered a visible anchor in the landscape. It offered a sense that the king's presence was not hidden, but declared. It offered a monumental calm that could be read from the valley, from a distance, as a statement of stability. Temples offer a different kind of calm, a calm of walking through ordered space. Rock-cut tombs offer a different kind of calm, a calm of stepping into a decorated interior where the walls tell a story. Each form expresses order in a different way. If you're listening to this for sleep, it can be comforting to imagine how these different monument types would feel at different times of day. A pyramid at dawn, brightening slowly. A temple courtyard in morning shade, columns holding cool air. A rock-cut tomb entrance in the heat of day. A dark opening that feels like relief from light. Egypt's architecture is full of these contrasts. Light and shadow, open and enclosed, mass and space. Now, to keep our pyramid focus steady, we can bring ourselves back to one particular question that many people find calming when answered clearly. What did pyramids look like when they were new, not only in terms of casing stones, but in terms of color, surfaces, temple decoration, and the surrounding environment? Because modern ruins can feel monochrome, but the ancient world was not always monochrome. And imagining pyramids as living sites, with smoother surfaces, cleaner lines, and active temple spaces, can help the mind drift into a more coherent, less fragmented picture of the past. Welcome to the last quiet stretch of our journey through pyramids, where we let the facts settle into one final steady picture. When people imagine pyramids, they often imagine them as they look today. Rough stepped surfaces, broken edges, pale stone exposed, and open desert all around. That image is real, but it belongs mostly to the pyramid's later life. Its long life as a stripped monument and a ruin, shaped by centuries of wind, reuse, and erosion. If we want to understand pyramids as they were meant to be experienced, it helps to imagine them when they were new, when the system around them still functioned, and when the monument looked less like a skeleton and more like a finished statement. A newly finished royal pyramid would likely have appeared smoother and brighter than most people expect. Fine casing limestone, carefully fitted, could create wide plains that caught sunlight in a clean, unified way. The edges would read sharply against the sky, and the whole monument could look almost like a single object rather than a structure made of thousands of stones. When the sun rose, the east face would brighten first, and the monument would seem to awaken with the day. In the afternoon, one face would glow warm, while another darkened, and the pyramid's geometry would become a calm play of contrast, a shape that makes time visible through shadow. Around that bright pyramid, the complex would have been more complete and more structured. The valley temple near the floodplain would connect the monument to river transport, to supplies, to the living economy that sustained the site. The causeway would form a deliberate route, long, directed, and controlled, leading upward toward the plateau, changing the feeling of the traveler with every step. And near the pyramid itself, the mortuary temple would stand as an active place, courtyards, altars, storerooms, and ritual spaces designed for repetition. Offerings would not be an occasional gesture. In the intended system, offerings were part of ongoing maintenance of the king's presence, a routine meant to keep order stable. This is one of the most important calm truths to hold in mind. Pyramids were not meant to be empty objects. They were meant to be centers of functioning institutions. They drew staff, supplies, records, and rituals into one place. And because institutions require organization, the pyramid story is always also a story of administration. Scribes counting deliveries and rations, officials managing stores and labor, and an entire state apparatus capable of sustaining a long project and then sustaining the cult that followed. If we return briefly to the question of construction, the most stable picture is still the simplest one. Pyramids were built through organized labor and practical engineering, quarrying limestone, and, for key spaces, transporting harder stone like granite from distant regions, moving heavy blocks with sledges along prepared routes, lifting and staging materials through ramp systems that could change as the monument grew, maintaining constant measurement and correction, so the faces stayed true, corners stayed crisp, and the base stayed level. Nothing about this requires lost technology. It requires discipline and time. It requires a society capable of repeating a hard thing without losing coordination. And that repetition has a human face. Near the monuments, people lived and worked. Food had to be prepared in huge quantities. Water had to be carried and distributed. Tools had to be repaired. Injuries had to be treated well enough for workers to return. The pyramid rises not only through strength, but through stability of routine. If the daily system collapses, the monument cannot continue. So the existence of the monument implies that the daily system held together. It also helps to remember that the pyramid itself is usually only one element of a larger cemetery landscape. Officials' tombs cluster near royal pyramids, reflecting hierarchy and proximity. Smaller pyramids and subsidiary monuments echo the main form, creating a royal environment rather than an isolated object. The site becomes a map of society, with the king at the center and layers of status arranged around that center in stone. Over time, the pyramid's first life, its life as an active institution, began to change. Dynasties shifted. Political priorities moved. Resources were redirected. New kings built new monuments, sometimes in different styles or different places. Maintenance weakened. Temples broke down. The cult activity dimmed. And once the site became quieter, it became more vulnerable because stone is valuable, and old monuments are convenient quarries. This is how the pyramid's appearance changed. The casing stones that once made it bright were removed and reused. When the casing is stripped away, The pyramid loses its smooth skin and the inner body becomes visible. More irregular, more stepped, more open to weather. As the surface becomes rougher, the monument weathers differently. Wind and rare rain find new pathways. Edges soften, seams widen. Sand gathers in low spaces and drifts away from high ones. The monument slowly transforms, not quickly enough to be dramatic, but steadily enough that centuries rewrite the surface. Ruin also changes meaning. A complete complex tells you what it is. A ruin complex invites guesses. That is why pyramids collected so many myths over time. Stories of hidden chambers, secret knowledge, impossible methods. But the calm, evidence-based story remains stronger because it explains not only the pyramid, but everything around it. Quarries, tools, settlements, temples, texts, and the long pattern of experimentation from early forms to more refined forms. And the longer the pyramids stood, the more they became historical objects, even within Egypt itself. Later Egyptians looked back at the Pyramid Age as deep past. Foreign travelers arrived and carried the monuments into new traditions of wonder. Modern archaeology arrived and replaced legend with mapping, measurement, and careful reconstruction of context. Each era added a layer of interpretation, but none of those layers changed the underlying truth. The pyramids are human achievements, built inside a human worldview. If you want the pyramids to feel less like distant mystery and more like calm understanding, one final thought can hold everything together. The pyramid is the meeting point of three steady forces. Belief gave the project purpose. Ideas about kingship, order, and continued existence through memory and ritual. Administration made the project possible. Surplus food, organized labor, transport networks, record keeping, and long-term coordination. Physics set the boundaries. Gravity, stone behavior, load management, slope stability, and the simple reality that heavy things demand careful arrangement. Belief, administration, and physics. A pyramid stands where those three agree. And when you look at the pyramid through that lens, it becomes quietly comprehensible. The monument is not a riddle with one hidden answer. It is a layered outcome of many small answers. Quarry choices, tool maintenance, rope work, ramp adjustments, corner checks, casing fits, temple routines, offering schedules, and the patient repetition of labor that turns time into stone. Now, as we let the story come to rest, you can allow the pyramids themselves to become what they often become in the mind at night. A symbol of steadiness, not a symbol of mystery, but of patience. A reminder that slow work can create lasting structure. A reminder that order can be built from repetition. A reminder that time can pass without erasing everything. Picture the plateau at dusk. The light lowers and softens. The pyramid's faces shift from bright to warm to muted. Wind moves quietly across stone. The desert holds its silence, and the monument remains, not because it is magical, but because it was built to be stable, built with heavy truth, built with careful lines, built to outlast the people who placed each block. If you enjoy sleep-friendly history like this, please subscribe for more long, calm videos. And now you can let the pyramids fade into the background, as steady as a horizon while you rest.